It was on a particularly wretched morning in late November that the case of the vanishing heir first came to our attention. The gaslights flickered uncertainly against the encroaching London fog, their glow failing to dispel the oppressive gloom that had settled over the city like a funereal shroud. I had spent the better part of the morning engaged in perusing the newspapers, while my friend, Sherlock Holmes, had taken to his usual pastime of analysing tobacco ash samples, his long fingers delicately sifting through the remains of some burnt specimen in a porcelain dish. There had been little of interest in the Times, save for a report of a minor scandal in the House of Lords and the usual dreary accounts of burglaries, disappearances, and frauds. None, I suspected, would be of particular interest to Holmes. He had been unusually silent all morning, save for the occasional hum of approval or disapproval as he examined his samples. It was precisely at 10:30 that our morning's idleness was interrupted by a sudden, frantic rapping at the door. Mrs. Hudson, with her characteristic efficiency, answered at once, and within moments, a young woman stepped into our sitting room, her face pale with distress, her breathing laboured from what I presumed was a hurried ascent up the stairs. She was striking, not for any excess of beauty, but for the sharp intensity of her features. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, but loose tendrils framed her high cheekbones, and her wide grey eyes shone with undisguised anxiety. "Mr. Holmes?" she said, her voice quivering yet determined. Holmes, who had not so much as looked up from his specimen dish during her entrance, now raised his gaze to meet hers. His sharp, hawk-like eyes swept over her in an instant, taking in every detail of her attire and demeanour. "Miss Eleanor Bancroft, I presume," he said, his tone as cool and precise as ever. The woman started visibly. You know my name?" she stammered. Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Your gloves, Miss Bancroft. The fine stitching and embroidered initials on the wrist suggest a woman of means, but their wear indicates recent travel. There is a smudge of carriage oil upon your left sleeve, suggesting haste. Your expression betrays not mere concern, but familial distress. That, combined with the fact that I have been following the inheritance disputes of the Bancroft family in the papers for the past several weeks, allows me to conclude that you are Miss Eleanor Bancroft, and that you have come regarding your brother." The young woman let out a faint gasp, clutching the folds of her coat more tightly around her. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is my brother Theodore. He has vanished." At this, I put down my newspaper. Holmes sat forward in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Tell me everything," he said. Eleanor Bancroft took a steadying breath. "My brother Theodore is the heir to the Bancroft estate," she began. "Our family has long been known for its wealth, but we have never been known for scandal or tragedy until now. 2 nights ago, my brother retired to his room as usual, just before midnight. The doors were locked, the windows secured. When the household awoke the next morning, Theodore was gone." "Gone?" I repeated. "You mean to say there was no sign of forced entry or struggle?" "None, Dr. Watson. His bed was untouched, his belongings undisturbed, and yet he had disappeared as though into thin air. The door was still locked from the inside, and the windows had not been tampered with." Holmes's brows furrowed. "A locked room disappearance, then? Fascinating. Continue." Eleanor nodded. I have reason to believe my brother was taken, Mr. Holmes. Or worse, that he left of his own accord, but under some terrible duress." "And why do you suspect this?" "Because of these," she said, reaching into her reticule and withdrawing a small bundle of folded papers. She handed them to Holmes with trembling fingers. He received these letters in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. They frightened him, though he tried to hide it from me. Holmes took the bundle and unfolded the topmost letter, his keen eyes scanning its contents. It was a single sheet of parchment, yellowed with age, with just 3 words scrawled in a flowing hand. Seek the tapestry. A silence settled over the room. Holmes turned the letter over, inspecting the paper, the ink, even the creases in the fold. He then examined the other letters, 5 in total, each bearing the same 3 words, and no signature. Fascinating, he murmured. Tell me, Miss Bancroft, did your brother ever speak of these letters? He tried to dismiss them as nonsense, she said, but I could tell they disturbed him. He became withdrawn, nervous. He locked his study when he never had before, and he avoided guests. And then he was gone. Holmes handed me the letters, and I inspected them myself. There was something chilling in their simplicity. No threats, no demands, just the same cryptic phrase. Holmes stood suddenly, striding toward the window. He gazed out at the foggy street below, his fingers pressed together in deep thought. Miss Bancroft, there are 2 possibilities, he said at last. Either your brother was taken from his room by means we have yet to determine, or he left of his own will, compelled by something too great to resist. Eleanor paled. And which do you believe, Mr. Holmes? Holmes turned to her, his expression unreadable. That, he said, is what we shall endeavour to discover. He rang the bell for Mrs. Hudson. Watson, pack a bag. Miss Bancroft, we shall accompany you to Bancroft Manor at once. Eleanor let out a sigh of relief. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, she whispered. Holmes did not respond immediately. He reached for his coat, slipping it over his shoulders, but as he did so, his fingers brushed against something that had not been in his pocket before. He withdrew it, frowning. It was a small folded slip of paper. With deliberate care, he unfolded it. 3 words stared back at him. Seek the tapestry. I saw Holmes's grip tighten ever so slightly, though his face betrayed no emotion. He turned to me, his voice low but firm. Watson, he said, I believe this case has just become far more interesting. And with that, we set off into the unknown. It was not long before we found ourselves ensconced in a carriage, rattling through the fog-laden streets of London toward the Bancroft estate. The chill of late November had deepened, and even within the confines of our transport, the cold seemed to seep through the very walls, as if conspiring to chill the marrow of our bones. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his eyes fixed upon some unseen point beyond the misted carriage window. He had been silent since we departed 221 B. Baker Street, and though Miss Eleanor Bancroft had cast him more than one anxious glance, she seemed to understand that to interrupt his musings would be an offence against reason itself. I, however, had no such restraint. Holmes, I said at last, unable to endure the silence any longer. That note you found in your coat, it means that someone was in our rooms without our knowledge. Does this not trouble you? Holmes exhaled slowly, his gaze remaining fixed upon the window. It does not trouble me, Watson, he said, his voice measured. It intrigues me. I frowned. But how is it possible? Mrs. Hudson would never permit a stranger to enter unannounced. Quite so, Holmes agreed. And yet, someone has done precisely that. The letter, identical to those received by Mr. Bancroft, was placed in my coat pocket while it hung upon the rack. That means one of 2 things. Either our visitor was known to Mrs. Hudson, or they possess means of access beyond what we assume to be possible. I finished grimly. Precisely. Miss Bancroft had been listening intently, and now she spoke, her voice hushed. Do you think whoever left that note in your coat is the same person who took my brother? Holmes turned to her, his expression unreadable. I do not yet know if your brother was taken, or if he left of his own accord, Miss Bancroft. But I do know this. If these letters are not mere folly, then we are dealing with an intelligence that does not rely on crude force or idle threats. And that, my dear Watson, is infinitely more dangerous. At that moment, the carriage rounded a bend, and the outline of Bancroft Manor loomed into view through the swirling fog. The estate was a grand yet sombre affair, an old Georgian structure of darkened stone, its high windows staring out across the landscape like the empty sockets of a skull. The once manicured gardens had grown wild and untamed, as if reflecting the decay of whatever power had once dwelled within these walls. A long gravel drive led up to the entrance, where a pair of black lacquered doors stood closed against the world. As we disembarked, Miss Bancroft turned to us. "Mr. Holmes, I must warn you, though my family has employed the same staff for years, I cannot vouch for their honesty in this matter. Some have been with us longer than I can remember, and I fear there may be secrets within these walls even I do not know." Holmes regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "Fear not, Miss Bancroft. Whatever secrets this house holds, we shall unearth them soon enough." The heavy doors creaked open to reveal Mr. Graves, the Bancroft family butler, a wiry man with sunken cheeks and the bearing of one who had long since abandoned the notion of surprise. He inclined his head stiffly as Miss Bancroft stepped inside. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice dry as parchment, "I had not expected you to return so soon." Miss Bancroft hesitated. "I could not stay away while my brother is missing, Graves. I have brought Mr. Sherlock Holmes to investigate." Graves's gaze flickered toward Holmes, though his expression did not betray any reaction. "Very good, miss. Will the gentleman be requiring rooms for the night?" Holmes interjected smoothly. "That will depend entirely on what we find, Mr. Graves. But for now, I should like to see the room from which your master disappeared." The butler inclined his head once more. "As you wish, sir. Follow me." The interior of Bancroft Manor was as oppressive as its exterior. Dark-panelled walls, heavy drapery, and a sense of quiet decay that seemed to linger in the air like an unspoken whisper. The long corridors stretched endlessly into shadow, the high ceilings seeming almost to press downward rather than elevate. We ascended the grand staircase, our footsteps muffled by a long Persian runner, until we reached the second floor. Graves led us down a dimly lit hallway until we arrived at a large oak door at the end. "This is Master Theodore's chamber," he said. "It remains just as it was found yesterday morning." Holmes stepped forward, pressing lightly against the wood of the door. "Locked from the inside, you say?" "Yes, sir." "Has anyone entered the room since?" "No one but myself, sir. And even then, only to confirm that he was truly gone." Holmes nodded. "Very well. Watson, if you would." I stepped forward, producing my medical bag, from which I retrieved a set of small surgical instruments. With Holmes's guidance, I inserted a slender blade into the keyhole, manipulating the mechanism with great care. After a few moments, there was a faint click, and the door swung open. The chamber within was exactly as Miss Bancroft had described. The bed remained pristine, as if it had never been slept in. The fireplace was cold, the draperies drawn. A writing desk stood against the wall, a few loose papers scattered upon its surface. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of hasty departure. And yet, something was wrong. Holmes strode into the room, his gaze sweeping across the space like a falcon surveying its prey. He moved with slow precision, his fingers trailing along the edges of furniture, the surface of the mantelpiece. "Curious," he murmured. I followed his gaze. "What is it, Holmes?" He gestured toward the window. "Miss Bancroft, you said the windows were found locked from the inside." "Yes." Holmes reached for the window latch and applied the faintest pressure. It did not budge. He then took a magnifying lens from his pocket and examined the wooden frame carefully. And then, so subtle I almost missed it. His lips curved upward in the faintest ghost of a smile. "Ah," he said softly. "There it is." Miss Bancroft stiffened. "There what is, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes straightened, slipping his lens back into his pocket. He moved to the writing desk, where the stack of papers lay undisturbed. With a single deft motion, he lifted the top sheet, revealing a single slip of parchment hidden beneath it. Another letter, and upon it, the same 3 words, "Seek the Tapestry." Miss Bancroft let out a small gasp. "Another one!" Holmes's gaze darkened. Yes, and it was placed here with great intent. He turned to face us, his expression sharper than ever. "Watson, Miss Bancroft, I believe we are dealing with an intelligence that does not simply wish to leave messages." He tapped the parchment lightly against his fingers. They wished to be found. Holmes stood by the desk, the slip of parchment between his long, dexterous fingers. The faint glow of the gas lamp cast elongated shadows across the room, highlighting the stillness of the chamber. The very air seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Seek the tapestry. It was a message, but was it a clue, a warning, or a taunt? Holmes had seen many cryptic messages in his time, but few had come with such an eerie sense of design. Miss Eleanor Bancroft, still pale from the shock of finding yet another letter, took a cautious step forward. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "this means my brother received this letter before he vanished, doesn't it?" Holmes turned the parchment over, scrutinizing its texture and folds. "Possibly," he murmured, "or it was placed here after he disappeared, left as a deliberate trail for us to find." A shudder passed over her. "For us to find," she repeated. "But who would do such a thing?" Holmes smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "That, Miss Bancroft, is precisely what we shall determine." Holmes began his meticulous examination of Theodore Bancroft's chamber. The locked room scenario was not an unfamiliar puzzle to him, but the circumstances were unusual. He moved with calculated intent, his fingers trailing lightly over surfaces, his gaze scanning the chamber as if drinking in details invisible to ordinary men. I watched in silence, accustomed as I was to his peculiar methods. He had once told me, in his ever-condescending manner, that the world teems with obvious facts which nobody ever observes. I had learned long ago to trust in his extraordinary powers of deduction. "Watson," he said suddenly, without looking up, "what do you make of the bed?" I glanced over at it. The coverlet was perfectly undisturbed, the pillows immaculate. "It doesn't appear to have been slept in." "Indeed. And what does that suggest?" I frowned. "That Theodore Bancroft never retired for the night." "Quite so, but look closer." I stepped forward and studied the bed more carefully. At first, nothing seemed amiss. But then, I noticed something subtle, too subtle for an untrained eye. "The pillow," I murmured. "It is ever so slightly indented." Holmes gave an approving nod. "Very good, Watson. The bed has not been slept in, but someone rested their head here, only briefly. Perhaps to think, or perhaps to wait." Miss Bancroft gave a sharp intake of breath. "Wait for what?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned toward the window. "Let us examine the only other means of exit." Holmes stepped to the tall, arched window that overlooked the expansive grounds of Bancroft Manor. A thick layer of frost rimmed the glass, evidence that it had not been opened in some time. "Miss Bancroft, you are certain this was locked from the inside when you discovered your brother missing?" "Absolutely." Holmes pressed his fingertips against the wooden window frame, tracing them along its edge. He paused at the bottom left corner, his eyes narrowing. "Ah," he said softly. "There it is." I hurried to his side. "What is it, Holmes?" "An almost imperceptible mark, here, at the seam of the window frame." I squinted, and indeed there was a faint scratch, barely visible against the dark wood. "It suggests," Holmes continued, "that the window was opened, if only momentarily, and then shut again." Miss Bancroft clasped a hand over her mouth. Then he did leave through the window." Holmes tilted his head. "Perhaps. Or someone entered this way." "But the window is 3 stories up," she protested. "There is no ledge, no drain pipe that could be climbed." Holmes tapped his fingers against the glass thoughtfully. "True, the descent would be impossible without assistance. But the fact remains, someone interacted with this window during the night." He turned away and continued his examination. Holmes next directed his attention to Theodore Bancroft's writing desk, which sat in the far corner of the room, papers scattered across its surface. He lifted the topmost letter, holding it up to the light. The ink was smudged, as if someone had run a hand over it in frustration or haste. He read aloud, "My dear Eleanor, I have reason to believe that the old stories may be true after all. I cannot explain it yet, but I have found something that has been hidden for a long time. I must be careful. If you see this, please know that I love you, and that I am doing what I must. Do not come looking for me. Trust no one." It was unsigned. Eleanor let out a small cry. "That is Theodore's handwriting." Holmes's expression darkened. Then it appears he had reason to fear for his safety. Holmes took a final slow lap around the chamber, his sharp gaze missing nothing. He paused near the fireplace, where the faintest traces of disturbed dust were visible on the floor. Holmes crouched down and examined the disturbance with great care. "Someone stood here," he muttered. I knelt beside him. "How can you tell?" "Because the dust has been compressed, yet the footprint is incomplete. It suggests someone stood near the hearth but did not move, as though they were waiting. But for what?" Miss Bancroft shivered. "I don't like this, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned his sharp gaze toward her. "Nor should you, Miss Bancroft." The pieces were falling into place, though the full picture remained obscured. Holmes finally stood, dusting off his hands. This was not a simple vanishing. Something, or someone, compelled Theodore Bancroft to leave. The locked door, the untouched bed, the message. Holmes finally stood, dusting off his hands. This was not a simple vanishing. Something, or someone, compelled Theodore Bancroft to leave. The locked door, the untouched bed, the message. He trailed off, his sharp eyes drifting back to the writing desk. With renewed focus, he strode toward it and opened a small drawer, rifling through its contents. Inside lay an assortment of letters, wax seals, and neatly arranged quills. But what caught his attention was a small brass key tucked into the corner. "Ah," he murmured, holding it up to the light. Eleanor Bancroft leaned forward. "That is my brother's study key. He always kept it with him." "Curious," Holmes said. "If Theodore had indeed vanished by force, why would he have left behind the key to his own private refuge?" I glanced at Holmes, my brow furrowing. Unless he left voluntarily and expected to return. "Precisely, Watson." Holmes pocketed the key, his gaze shifting toward the fireplace once more. He strode toward the hearth and crouched down, running a gloved hand along the blackened grate. The faintest smudges of charcoal dust clung to his fingers, but something else caught his attention. A curled, half-burned scrap of parchment nestled within the ashes. With careful precision, he plucked it from the soot and held it up to the dim light. The edges were singed, the ink faded, but part of the message remained legible. Is older than England itself. It was never meant to be. The remainder of the sentence had been lost to the flames. Holmes stared at it, his expression unreadable. Watson, I believe our friend Theodore was tampering with something much larger than himself. Holmes returned to the window, opening it carefully this time. A frigid gust of air swirled into the room, making Miss Bancroft shiver. Impossible, I muttered, peering out. A drop of nearly 30 feet to the courtyard below. No rope, no evidence of a ladder, nothing. Holmes examined the outer ledge, his fingers moving delicately over the stone. No forced entry, no damage to the frame, and yet... His voice softened, barely above a whisper. Someone used this window. I stared at him. Holmes, how? Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he withdrew a small magnifying lens from his pocket and scanned the edge of the windowsill, pausing near an almost imperceptible notch in the wood. It was small, no larger than a matchstick, but it had been deliberately carved. He touched it lightly, as though confirming a suspicion. This, he said at last, was not an ordinary exit. He turned back to Eleanor. Miss Bancroft, is there anyone in this household, past or present, who would have had knowledge of secret passages, hidden mechanisms, or unusual architectural features of the manor? She frowned, shaking her head. Not that I know of, but the manor is quite old. There are entire wings that have been sealed off for years. My great-grandfather expanded it decades ago, though much of that knowledge has been lost to time. Holmes tapped a thoughtful finger against his lips. Lost to time, or deliberately buried. Holmes turned his attention to the floorboards, his boot tapping against them in a rhythmic pattern. He moved across the room with methodical precision, listening for changes in acoustics. Then, near the foot of the bed, he paused. A single floorboard creaked, just slightly different than the others. With deft hands, he knelt and pried it up, revealing a narrow, dust-laden gap beneath. And within that gap lay something unexpected, a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Eleanor let out a sharp gasp as Holmes retrieved it. That cannot have been left there recently, she whispered. Holmes unfolded the parchment, his gaze sharpening as he read aloud. In the weave of the tapestry, the pattern repeats. Time bends, and the knowledge that must not be known is buried anew. The door remains locked to those who seek blindly. The room fell into silence. I exhaled, shaking my head. Holmes, what in heaven's name does that mean? Holmes did not respond immediately. He traced the words with his fingertips, his expression unreadable. The tapestry again, he murmured. But this message, this was not written by Theodore Bancroft. This is older. Older, Eleanor whispered. How old? Holmes folded the parchment carefully, slipping it into his coat. That, Miss Bancroft, is a question we must endeavour to answer. But first... He turned toward the butler, Mr. Graves, who had been lingering uneasily in the doorway. Mr. Graves, how long have you served this household? The butler stiffened. 37 years, sir. And in those years, have you ever heard whispers, rumours about the tapestry? Mr. Graves hesitated for the briefest moment. Then, his face smoothed into a careful neutrality. I cannot say that I have, sir. Holmes smiled slightly, though there was no humour in it. Of course. How foolish of me to ask. The butler's lips thinned, but he said nothing. Holmes turned back to Eleanor. Miss Bancroft, I believe our next course of action is clear. She nodded, gripping the folds of her dress. Yes. We must find my brother. Holmes exhaled, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Yes, he murmured. And to do that, we must first find the tapestry. He glanced once more at the window, the scorched parchment, and the hidden message beneath the boards. Then, With a decisive nod, he strode toward the door. "Come, Watson," he said. "We have much to do." The heavy silence of the room remained long after Holmes had pocketed the aged parchment, its cryptic words hanging in the air like the last notes of a fading melody. Miss Eleanor Bancroft's face was a portrait of restrained emotion, fear, hope, and an unwillingness to believe that her brother had walked willingly into some dark fate. Holmes turned to her with quiet assurance. "Miss Bancroft, we must now focus on what we do know. You mentioned your brother had received multiple letters before his disappearance. Are these all still in your possession?" "Yes," she said, straightening. "They are kept in his study. I thought little of them at first, but now—" She swallowed hard. "Now I fear they were a warning." Holmes nodded. "Lead the way." The study was located at the far end of the west wing, a grand oak-panelled room lined with towering bookshelves, their leather-bound volumes untouched by dust. The scent of old parchment and ink lingered in the air, mingling with a faint trace of pipe tobacco, evidence that Theodore Bancroft had spent much of his time here. Holmes entered first, his keen gaze sweeping across the room. He moved deliberately, his fingers brushing the polished desk, the marble fireplace, the mahogany bookcases, absorbing every detail. Eleanor strode to a drawer, producing a small bundle of letters tied together with a silk ribbon. She placed them upon the desk with an air of hesitation. "Here," she said. "These are the ones he received over the past 2 months." Holmes untied the bundle and fanned them out upon the desk. Each envelope was identical, cream-coloured parchment, the edges neatly cut, sealed with a plain wax insignia that bore no crest, no initials. But it was the handwriting that commanded his full attention. Holmes lifted the first letter, studying the sharp, deliberate script. He read aloud, "Mr. Bancroft, the time has come. Seek the tapestry." There was no signature. He glanced at the next letter. "To the heir of Bancroft, the design repeats itself. The pattern must not be ignored." Again, unsigned. Holmes continued, his sharp eyes scanning each new message. "Follow the woven path. The answer lies where it has always been. There is no escape from knowledge. Only choices remain." And then, the most recent. "The tapestry is not a thing, but a design. Those who see it must decide their fate." Holmes placed the final letter down, tapping a slender finger against its surface. "Fascinating," he murmured. Watson frowned. "What do you make of them, Holmes?" Holmes did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention to the wax seals. He plucked up a magnifying lens from the desk and studied one of the imprints. Then, with the faintest exhale, he smiled. "Watson, do you notice anything peculiar?" I stepped forward, peering over his shoulder. At first, the plain wax seal seemed unremarkable. But then, as I squinted, I saw it. A faint impression, barely perceptible, within the wax. A woven knot. "My word," I murmured. "Not an accident," Holmes said. "A deliberate signature for those who know how to read it." He turned to Eleanor. "Have you ever seen this symbol before?" She hesitated, brow furrowed. "No, but—" Her fingers brushed against the edge of one of the envelopes. "It does remind me of something." Holmes leaned forward. "Go on." She turned toward the bookshelf and ran her hands along the spines of old tomes. "My great-grandfather was something of an eccentric. He commissioned a family crest, but he abandoned it after only a few months. It was never used, but I remember seeing his first sketches when I was a child. The design was something intricate, something woven, a knot of some kind." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And where are these sketches now?" Eleanor hesitated. "If they still exist, they would be in the attic archives. No one has touched them in years." Holmes set down the letters with a decisive nod. "Then that is where we must go next. Before we could leave the study, a sharp knock interrupted us. The door creaked open, revealing Mr. Graves, the butler. "Miss Bancroft," he said stiffly. "Forgive me, but the staff has expressed concern." Eleanor frowned. "Concern?" "Yes, miss. There is talk among the servants. Some say they saw a figure near the estate on the night of Master Theodore's disappearance." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A figure? Describe him." Graves hesitated. "It is difficult to say, sir. Some claim it was a man in a dark coat, moving swiftly across the east gardens. But others—" He trailed off. "Speak freely, Graves," Holmes urged. The butler exhaled. "Others insist the figure was not walking at all, but gliding." Eleanor stiffened. "That is absurd." "Indeed," Holmes said, though his expression was unreadable. "And yet, the mind does not conjure such images without some kernel of truth." Graves's lips pressed together. "I trust little in rumours, sir, but I thought you should know." Holmes inclined his head. "You are right to tell us." Graves hesitated a moment longer before nodding and retreating from the room. I turned to Holmes. "Gliding?" I repeated skeptically. Holmes gave a half smile. "Superstition and fear are poor foundations for truth, Watson, but they are excellent indicators that something unnatural, by appearance or deception, is at play." Eleanor shook her head. "I trust my staff, Mr. Holmes, but I cannot entertain such nonsense." "Then let us separate nonsense from reality," Holmes said. "We must speak to those who saw this figure for themselves." He reached for his coat and turned toward the door. "But first, Watson." "Yes?" "Before we interview our witnesses, we must find those sketches." He gestured toward the grand staircase leading to the uppermost level of Bancroft Manor. "To the attic, then," I said grimly. "To the attic," Holmes confirmed. And with that, we climbed toward the shadows above. The staircase leading to the attic archives was narrow and steep, the wooden steps creaking beneath our weight as we ascended. A thick veil of dust clung to the air, disturbed only by the flickering glow of our lanterns. The air grew noticeably colder with each step, as if we were crossing into a part of the house untouched by time. At the top landing, an arched wooden door loomed before us, its brass handle tarnished, the keyhole long rusted. Eleanor shivered slightly. "No one has been up here in years," she murmured. "The last time I entered this attic, I was a child." Holmes, who had been studying the edges of the doorframe, withdrew a fine metal pick from his pocket. "Then let us see if the past has left us any clues." With practiced efficiency, he inserted the pick into the lock and turned it gently. A soft click echoed in the silence. The door creaked open. The attic stretched out before us, vast and shrouded in shadow. Rows of wooden crates, dust-covered trunks, and ancient furniture lay haphazardly arranged across the floor. Tall, narrow windows lined the far wall, their glass panes fogged with age, allowing only the faintest moonlight to filter through. Holmes stepped forward, his keen gaze scanning the forgotten relics of the Bancroft lineage. "We must locate those sketches," he murmured, striking a match and lighting a kerosene lamp. The golden glow illuminated the space, revealing a long wooden chest with an intricately carved lid resting against the far wall. "Miss Bancroft," Holmes called, "would your great-grandfather have kept personal records within a chest such as this?" Eleanor hesitated. "That belonged to him, yes, but I never dared open it." Holmes knelt and examined the ornate carvings along the chest's lid. "Curious," he muttered. "These patterns, they resemble the woven knot from the wax seals on the letters." Watson frowned. "Are you suggesting the family crest and the tapestry are linked?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he lifted the latch and raised the heavy lid. Inside, nestled among faded documents and brittle parchments, lay a rolled-up sheet of canvas. Holmes withdrew it carefully, unrolling it on a nearby crate. We leaned in, and there it was. A sketch of an intricate tapestry design, interwoven with strange symbols and coded markings, and at its centre, the unmistakable woven knot emblem. Eleanor gasped. That is the crest. But what are these markings around it? Holmes traced the symbols with his gloved fingers. Not heraldry, he murmured. This is something else entirely. He studied the bottom edge of the sketch, where faint, handwritten words had been scrawled. The path is woven. The door lies beneath the house. Holmes straightened. Watson, he said, his voice edged with excitement. I believe we have just discovered a hidden passage. Holmes wasted no time. Miss Bancroft, do you recall any stories of tunnels or secret rooms beneath the manor? Eleanor shook her head. No, but the manor has been renovated several times. There are entire sections that were sealed off decades ago. Holmes turned back to the sketch, his eyes darting between the symbols and the inscription. The door lies beneath the house. He exhaled sharply. That means a subterranean level exists, a hidden chamber beneath Bancroft Manor. Watson rubbed his chin. But how do we find the entrance? Holmes studied the wooden flooring of the attic, tapping his cane lightly against different sections. His expression remained impassive until, suddenly, his cane produced a hollow echo. Holmes's eyes gleamed. There, he murmured. He knelt, brushing away layers of dust, revealing a rectangular outline in the floorboards. A trapdoor! Eleanor gasped. Holmes grasped the iron handle embedded in the wood and gave it a firm pull. With a groan of rusted hinges, the trapdoor swung open, revealing a narrow stone stairwell descending into darkness. The passageway had been hidden for decades, possibly longer. Holmes turned to us. Watson, Miss Bancroft, shall we? The air grew colder and heavier as we descended the narrow steps. The walls, made of ancient stone, bore deep etchings, symbols identical to those on the tapestry sketch. Eleanor hesitated. What is this place? Holmes did not answer immediately. He was running his fingers over one of the etched symbols, as if reading a language long forgotten. Watson, he murmured, do you recall our case in Sussex involving the ancient crypt beneath the monastery? I frowned. Yes, that was a passage designed to be deliberately concealed. Do you believe this to be similar? Holmes's lips curled slightly. Not just similar, my friend. Identical. The implication settled over us like a storm cloud. Eleanor's voice wavered. Are you saying this passage was deliberately erased from the history of this house? Holmes's eyes flickered toward her. And I believe we are about to discover why. We continued downwards, the light from our lanterns flickering against the damp walls. The passage eventually opened into a long underground corridor, lined with crumbling brick arches. At the far end of the passage, a massive wooden door loomed before us. Reinforced with iron bands, its surface scarred by deep gouges, and at the centre of the door, a familiar emblem had been carved into the wood. The woven knot. Holmes inhaled deeply. Well, well, he murmured. It seems Theodore Bancroft was not the first to come searching. With that, he stepped forward and pressed his palm against the door. A deep click echoed through the chamber. The door shifted slightly, not opening, but unlocking. Holmes turned back to us, his gaze sharp. Prepare yourselves, he said softly. We are about to uncover something that was never meant to be found. And with that, he pushed the door open. As the heavy wooden door groaned open, an ancient gust of air swept past us, damp, stale, and laced with something I could not immediately place. The lantern's glow cast long, dancing shadows along the stone walls of what lay beyond. The chamber before us was vast. The ceiling stretched high above our heads, ribbed with wooden beams blackened by time. Shelves lined the walls, filled with disintegrating books, brittle parchments, and rusted objects whose original purpose had long been lost to history. A single massive tapestry, faded yet unmistakable, hung at the far end of the chamber. Eleanor gasped, stepping closer. "The Bancroft tapestry," she whispered. "I thought it had been lost." Holmes's gaze narrowed sharply, or hidden. He strode forward, brushing his gloved fingers over the frayed edges of the tapestry. The design, once intricate, had faded, but its centerpiece remained clear. A large woven knot, encircling a spiraling pattern of cryptic symbols. Watson stepped closer. "This is no ordinary family heirloom," he murmured. Holmes nodded. "No, Watson, this is a cipher." Eleanor turned to him, her expression tight with growing unease. "But why would my great-grandfather go to such lengths to conceal this? What does it mean?" Holmes studied the tapestry intently, his fingers tapping lightly at his side in thought. "That, Miss Bancroft, is precisely what we must determine." Holmes retrieved his magnifying glass and began meticulously scanning the fabric. His expression remained unreadable until, at last, he exhaled sharply. "There," he murmured, pointing toward a barely perceptible alteration in the stitching along the lower portion of the tapestry. Eleanor and I squinted at the spot he indicated. "It looks like an addition," I said. Holmes nodded. "A recent one, at least in comparison to the rest of the tapestry." He produced a small penknife from his coat and, with surgical precision, slit open a seam in the fabric. A thin slip of parchment slid free and fluttered to the stone floor. Eleanor stooped to pick it up, her fingers trembling. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a single line of text, hastily scrawled in dark ink. "Find the woodsman's path. The answer lies where the trees stand oldest." Eleanor paled. "The woods!" Holmes straightened, his gaze turning calculating. "Miss Bancroft, your estate borders a wooded area, does it not?" "Yes, the old Briar Woods," she confirmed. "It has been there for centuries." Holmes's gaze darkened. "Then that is where we must go next." The night air was bitingly cold as we made our way toward the twisting woods behind Bancroft Manor. A narrow dirt path, barely visible under the moonlight, wound its way through towering oaks and gnarled yews. Holmes led the way, his cane tapping lightly against the uneven ground as he examined every detail of our surroundings. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself. "The locals say these woods are haunted," she murmured. Watson scoffed. "Superstition, nothing more." Holmes, however, did not seem as dismissive. "Superstition often masks something real," he murmured, "a truth distorted by time and fear." Moments later, he halted abruptly, kneeling down in the dirt. "Watson, light!" I raised my lantern, illuminating the ground before him. A set of footprints, partially obscured by fallen leaves, led deeper into the woods. "They are fresh," Holmes observed. "Less than 48 hours old. Someone came this way recently." Eleanor's breath hitched. Could it have been Theodore? Holmes traced the direction of the prints. "Possibly, but he was not alone." Watson stiffened. "You mean—" Holmes gestured a few feet to the left. "There, another set of tracks, much heavier. Likely a second man, larger than Theodore." Eleanor clasped a hand over her mouth. Then, was he being followed? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Or led? We followed the tracks deeper into the forest, winding between ancient towering trees. The air was still, as if the entire wood held its breath. Then at last, we saw it. A small ruined cabin stood in a clearing, its roof partially caved in, ivy curling around its crumbling stone walls. Holmes strode forward without hesitation, his movements brisk and assured. The door was ajar, hanging from its hinges. We stepped inside. The interior was sparse, filled only with rotting wooden furniture and the smell of damp earth. A single wooden chair stood overturned near the fireplace, but it was what lay beside the chair that made my blood run cold. A dark stain upon the wooden floor. "Blood," Holmes murmured. Eleanor gasped. "Oh God! Theodore!" Holmes crouched and examined the darkened patch. "It is not fresh, but recent enough. And there is not enough of it to suggest serious injury." Watson exhaled. So he was here, but where is he now? Holmes studied the room meticulously, his sharp gaze scanning every surface. Then he found something. In the ashes of the cold fireplace, barely distinguishable from the soot, lay another slip of parchment. Holmes retrieved it, brushing away the charred edges. Once again, it contained only a few words. "You are not the first. You will not be the last." A chill ran down my spine. Holmes turned to us, his face unreadable. "Watson, Miss Bancroft, this is no ordinary disappearance. Someone does not want the truth to be found." Eleanor clenched her fists. "Then we have no choice. We must find whoever wrote this." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Yes, but we must tread carefully." He held up the burned message, his expression grave. "Because whoever they are already watching us." The air in the old briarwoods had turned eerily still. The faint rustling of leaves overhead seemed to whisper warnings too soft for human ears. Holmes held up the burned scrap of parchment we had just found in the ruined cabin, his sharp gaze scanning the shadows beyond the clearing. "You are not the first. You will not be the last." The message lingered in my mind like a distant echo, heavy with implication. Who had left this note? And who had come before Theodore? Holmes, however, was already moving. With swift precision, he knelt beside the blood-stained floorboards and traced his fingers lightly over the grooves. "The trail does not end here," he murmured. "There was a struggle. Yes, but no body. Theodore was either taken, or he fled." Eleanor swallowed hard. Where could he have gone? Holmes exhaled. Not far. Then, almost as if the forest itself had been listening, a sound drifted through the trees, a distant hollow chime. A bell. Holmes's eyes flickered with sudden intensity. "That would be the old chapel, would it not, Miss Bancroft?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "Yes, it is abandoned now, but it once belonged to the estate." Holmes smiled faintly. "Then that, Watson, is where we must go next." The ruins of the old chapel stood deep within the woods, barely visible beneath layers of ivy and decay. The stone archways, once proud and unyielding, had crumbled in places, exposing the rotting wooden beams within. A lone iron bell, rusted with age, still clung to its perch in the chapel tower. A sense of deep foreboding settled over the clearing as we approached. Even Eleanor, who had spent her childhood near these ruins, hesitated. "Holmes," I muttered, gripping the handle of my revolver. "Something about this place feels wrong." Holmes nodded, but his expression was unreadable. "That is because it is meant to feel that way, Watson." With that, he strode forward and pushed open the massive wooden doors. They groaned in protest, revealing the forgotten remains of a sanctuary long since abandoned. The interior was a cavern of dust and decay. The pews were rotting, their wooden frames splintered with time. Stained glass windows, shattered long ago, cast broken, multicoloured light upon the cold stone floors. At the far end of the chapel stood a stone altar, its surface scarred by deep gashes, as though someone had tried to destroy whatever once rested upon it. And on the wall behind the altar, barely visible beneath centuries of dust. A familiar woven knot. Eleanor gasped. That symbol! Holmes's eyes gleamed. The same as the letters. The same as the tapestry. We had found another piece of the puzzle. Holmes approached the altar, his fingers trailing over the carved stone. This was once an important place. Not just a chapel, but something more. I frowned. More? In what way? Holmes turned to me, his voice lowering. Watson, what do you know of buried secrets? Before I could answer, he pressed his hand against a specific section of the altar, a part of the stone smoother than the rest. There was a soft mechanical click. A section of the stone floor behind the altar shifted, revealing a dark, descending stairway. Eleanor clapped a hand to her mouth. I never knew. Holmes stepped back, his expression grim. Someone did. Without another word, he took his lantern and began the descent. I followed, my revolver at the ready. The stone staircase spiraled downward, the air growing colder with each step. The walls, unlike the chapel above, were smooth and reinforced, as though this place had been carved with deliberate precision. At last, we reached the bottom. The passage opened into a narrow stone chamber, lined with wooden shelves filled with ancient books and ledgers. In the centre of the room stood a single wooden chair, and beside it, chains bolted to the wall. And across from the chair, scrawled onto the damp stone wall, was a message written in deep red ink. Or perhaps, blood. The knowledge must not leave. The pattern must not be broken. Eleanor let out a small cry. Dear God. Holmes, however, was eerily calm. He walked to the shelves and pulled down a large dust-covered ledger. Its title read, The Tapestry Society, Records of the Chosen. Holmes flipped open the ledger, his fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. The entries were meticulously recorded, listing names, dates, and locations, some dating back more than 100 years. I leaned in, my breath catching as I scanned the list. The names varied, some crossed out, others left unmarked. Then, near the bottom of the most recent page, I saw it. Theodore Bancroft. Beside it, the date of his disappearance. Eleanor's hand shot to her mouth. No, this can't be. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Your brother was not taken at random, Miss Bancroft. He was selected. Eleanor turned to him, desperation in her eyes. Selected for what? Holmes tapped the open page. That, Miss Bancroft, is the question we must answer. Suddenly, a sound echoed from above, a sharp creak, like a footstep, against the wooden floor of the chapel. Eleanor stiffened. Did you hear that? Holmes's expression sharpened. We are not alone. I raised my revolver, my heartbeat quickening. Holmes extinguished the lantern, plunging us into darkness. Watson, do not move, he whispered. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, a faint rustling, a soft exhale, and then, a low voice from above. You should not have come here. Eleanor gasped. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Holmes, however, remained still as stone. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached into his coat and retrieved something. The burned parchment from the cabin. He held it up, his voice as cold as the air around us. Who else came before us? A long silence. Then, at last, the voice whispered back. You already know the answer? A sudden burst of movement, a shadow fleeing up the stairs. Holmes sprang after it. Watson, we must move! I grabbed Eleanor's wrist, and together we raced back up the stairwell, emerging once more into the ruined chapel. But by the time we reached the door, the figure was gone. Only the distant rustling of the woods remained. Holmes exhaled sharply, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scanned the clearing. They were watching us, he murmured. Watson swallowed. And they let us live. Holmes turned to face us, his expression unreadable. Not out of mercy, he said, out of calculation. Then, softly, he added, they want us to find the truth, but on their terms. The mystery was far from over. The air in the old briarwoods had turned eerily still. The faint rustling of leaves overhead seemed to whisper warnings too soft for human ears. Holmes held up the burned scrap of parchment we had just found in the ruined cabin, his sharp gaze scanning the shadows beyond the clearing. You are not the first. You will not be the last. The message lingered in my mind like a distant echo, heavy with implication. Who had left this note, and who had come before Theodore? Holmes, however, was already moving. With swift precision, he knelt beside the blood-stained floorboards and traced his fingers lightly over the grooves. The trail does not end here, he murmured. There was a struggle, yes, but no body. Theodore was either taken or he fled. Eleanor swallowed hard. Where could he have gone? Holmes exhaled. Not far. Then, almost as if the forest itself had been listening, a sound drifted through the trees, a distant, hollow chime. A bell. Holmes's eyes flickered with sudden intensity. That would be the old chapel, would it not, Miss Bancroft? Eleanor's expression darkened. Yes, it is abandoned now, but it once belonged to the estate. Holmes smiled faintly. Then that, Watson, is where we must go next. The ruins of the old chapel stood deep within the woods, barely visible beneath the layers of ivy and decay. The stone archways, once proud and unyielding, had crumbled in places, exposing the rotting wooden beams within. A lone iron bell, rusted with age, still clung to its perch in the chapel tower. A sense of deep foreboding settled over the clearing as we approached. Even Eleanor, who had spent her childhood near these ruins, hesitated. Holmes, I muttered, gripping the handle of my revolver. Something about this place feels wrong. Holmes nodded, but his expression was unreadable. That is because it is meant to feel that way, Watson. With that, he strode forward and pushed open the massive wooden doors. They groaned in protest, revealing the forgotten remains of a sanctuary long since abandoned. The interior was a cavern of dust and decay. The pews were rotting, their wooden frames splintered with time. Stained glass windows, shattered long ago, cast broken, multicoloured light upon the cold stone floors. At the far end of the chapel stood a stone altar, its surface scarred by deep gashes, as though someone had tried to destroy whatever once rested upon it. And on the wall behind the altar, barely visible beneath centuries of dust, a familiar woven knot. Eleanor gasped. That symbol! Holmes's eyes gleamed. The same as the letters, the same as the tapestry. We had found another piece of the puzzle. Holmes approached the altar, his fingers trailing over the carved stone. This was once an important place, not just a chapel, but something more, I frowned. More? In what way? Holmes turned to me, his voice lowering. Watson, what do you know of buried secrets? Before I could answer, he pressed his hand against a specific section of the altar, a part of the stone smoother than the rest. There was a soft, mechanical click. A section of the stone floor behind the altar shifted, revealing a dark, descending stairway. Eleanor clapped a hand to her mouth. I never knew. Holmes stepped back, his expression grim. Someone did. Without another word, he took his lantern and began the descent. I followed, my revolver at the ready. The stone staircase spiraled downward, the air growing colder with each step. The walls, unlike the chapel above, were smooth and reinforced, as though this place had been carved with deliberate precision. At last, we reached the bottom. The passage opened into a narrow stone chamber, lined with wooden shelves filled with ancient books and ledgers. In the centre of the room stood a single wooden chair, and beside it, chains bolted to the wall. And across from the chair, scrawled onto the damp stone wall, was a message written in deep red ink. Or perhaps, blood. The knowledge must not leave, the pattern must not be broken. Eleanor let out a small cry. Dear God! Holmes, however, was eerily calm. He walked to the shelves and pulled down a large dust-covered ledger. Its title read, The Tapestry Society, Records of the Chosen. Holmes flipped open the ledger, his fingers carefully turning the brittle pages. The entries were meticulously recorded, listing names, dates, and locations, some dating back more than 100 years. I leaned in, my breath catching as I scanned the list. The names varied, some crossed out, others left unmarked. Then, near the bottom of the most recent page, I saw it. Theodore Bancroft. Beside it, the date of his disappearance. Eleanor's hand shot to her mouth. No, this can't be. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Your brother was not taken at random, Miss Bancroft. He was selected. Eleanor turned to him, desperation in her eyes. Selected for what? Holmes tapped the open page. That, Miss Bancroft, is the question we must answer. Suddenly, a sound echoed from above, a sharp creak like a footstep against the wooden floor of the chapel. Eleanor stiffened. Did you hear that? Holmes's expression sharpened. We are not alone. I raised my revolver, my heartbeat quickening. Holmes extinguished the lantern, plunging us into darkness. Watson, do not move, he whispered. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, a faint rustling, a soft exhale, and then, a low voice from above. You should not have come here. Eleanor gasped. I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. Holmes, however, remained still as stone. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached into his coat and retrieved something. The burned parchment from the cabin. He held it up, his voice as cold as the air around us. Who else came before us? A long silence. Then, at last, the voice whispered back. You already know the answer. A sudden burst of movement, a shadow fleeing up the stairs. Holmes sprang after it. Watson, we must move. I grabbed Eleanor's wrist, and together we raced back up the stairwell, emerging once more into the ruined chapel. But by the time we reached the door, the figure was gone. Only the distant rustling of the woods remained. Holmes exhaled sharply, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scanned the clearing. They were watching us, he murmured. Watson swallowed. And they let us live. Holmes turned to face us, his expression unreadable. Not out of mercy, he said, out of calculation. Then softly he added, They want us to find the truth, but on their terms. The mystery was far from over. The journey back to Bancroft Manor was made in uneasy silence. The revelations within the old chapel had shifted the entire nature of our investigation. Theodore Bancroft's disappearance was no mere act of kidnapping or escape. It was part of a larger design, an intricate web of secrecy woven by an entity calling itself the Tapestry Society. As our carriage rumbled along the winding path back to the manor, Eleanor sat rigidly beside me, her face drawn with anxiety. I knew what troubled her most, the ledger, the list of names, and her brother's presence among them. Holmes, for his part, remained deep in thought, his sharp gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the fogged carriage window. At last, Eleanor could endure the silence no longer. Mr. Holmes, she said softly, if my brother was selected, does that mean he was willing, that he chose this? Holmes turned to her, his expression unreadable. Miss Bancroft, There are many ways to make a man choose something against his will. The real question is, did he truly understand what he was choosing? Eleanor looked down, twisting her hands in her lap. I just want him back. Holmes's gaze softened, just slightly. Then let us begin with those who may know more than they have admitted. The carriage pulled up before the grand black lacquered doors of Bancroft Manor. Tonight, we would speak with the servants, and someone would break. Upon our arrival, Mr. Graves, the ever-stoic butler, met us at the entrance. His expression, as always, was impassive, but I sensed a stiffness in his movements, a subtle tightening of the jaw. Holmes wasted no time. Mr. Graves, I require all members of the household staff to be assembled in the drawing room within the next 10 minutes. Graves hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. All of them, sir. Yes, every last one. With a slight incline of his head, Graves turned and disappeared into the depths of the manor. Holmes watched him go, then turned to me. Watson, keep your eyes on their faces tonight. We are looking for a reaction, however small. 10 minutes later, we stood before a gathered assembly of Bancroft Manor's servants. There were 5 in total, aside from Graves. 1. Mary Simmons, the housemaid, a woman in her early 30s with a nervous disposition. 2. Joseph Harper, the groundskeeper, a weathered man with calloused hands and a tendency to avoid eye contact. 3. Margaret Finch, the cook, a stout woman with watchful eyes and a reputation for gossip. 4. Henry Woods, the stable hand, a quiet, lanky youth of about 19. 5. Thomas Redford, the footman, older, with a perpetual scowl and dark circles beneath his eyes. Graves stood apart from them, his presence looming like a silent sentinel. Holmes studied each of them with quiet intensity. Gentlemen, ladies, he began smoothly, you know why we are here. Silence. Then Margaret Finch spoke up, wiping her hands on her apron. We know Master Theodore is missing, sir, and we want to help, but I swear, none of us know where he's gone. Holmes smiled faintly. Perhaps. And yet, we have discovered a great many secrets hidden within this house. Secrets which some of you may know more about than you claim. A ripple of unease passed through the group. Let us begin, Holmes continued, stepping forward, with the night of the disappearance. Holmes turned to Mary Simmons, the housemaid, who visibly stiffened under his scrutiny. Miss Simmons, he said, his voice light but firm. On the night your master vanished, you were the last servant to see him, were you not? Mary hesitated, glancing toward Graves as if seeking silent permission to speak. The butler's face remained blank. Yes, she stammered at last. I brought him tea around 10:30. And was he alone? Holmes pressed. She nodded. Yes, sir. Holmes tilted his head. And did you notice anything unusual? Mary swallowed hard. Master Theodore was uneasy that night. He barely touched his tea, kept staring out the window like he was waiting for something. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Waiting for what? Mary shook her head. I don't know, sir. But before I left, he asked me. Her voice faltered. Holmes stepped closer. Yes. Mary's hands twisted in her apron. He asked me to lock the door behind me from the outside. A chill ran down my spine. Did you do it? Holmes asked softly. Mary nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, sir. Eleanor gasped. Then he chose to be locked in. Mary looked away. I didn't ask why. I just did as he said. Holmes's gaze lingered on her for a long moment before he turned away. Interesting. Holmes then fixed his gaze upon Joseph Harper, the groundskeeper. You patrol the estate at night, do you not? Holmes asked. Harper shifted. "Aye, sir, every night." Holmes folded his arms. And yet, on the night in question, we are told that a figure was seen gliding across the east gardens. Harper exhaled through his nose. "That weren't no ghost, if that's what you're asking." Eleanor's breath caught. "Then you saw it?" "Aye. I saw someone," Harper admitted. "Didn't see their face, but they moved quick. Too quick for my liking." Holmes's voice was silk and steel. "Did they come from the house, or were they going toward it?" Harper hesitated. "They were leaving," he said at last. "Into the woods." Holmes's gaze flickered. "Towards the old chapel?" Harper nodded grimly. A thick silence settled over the room. Holmes then turned to Mr. Graves. "You are the head of this household staff," Holmes said. "Surely you must have noticed something amiss before Theodore Bancroft vanished." Graves's jaw tightened. "I noticed nothing, sir." Holmes smiled slightly. "Nothing at all?" "No." Holmes stepped closer. "Then tell me, Mr. Graves." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Why do your hands smell of candle wax?" Graves stiffened. The servants glanced between each other in confusion. Holmes reached into his coat and retrieved the old ledger from the hidden chapel chamber. With slow, deliberate motion, he opened it and turned it toward Graves. "Do you recognize this book?" For the first time since our arrival, the butler's mask cracked. A flicker of recognition, quick as lightning, crossed his face. Holmes saw it. "Ah," he murmured. "I see." Graves clenched his fists. "I don't know what you think you found, Mr. Holmes." Holmes held up a hand. "No need, Mr. Graves. You've told me everything I needed to know." Eleanor exhaled sharply. "Holmes, what does this mean?" Holmes turned to us, his eyes gleaming with certainty. "It means, my dear Watson, that Theodore Bancroft was not the only one who knew about the tapestry." He turned back to Graves. "And he is going to tell us exactly what it all means." The butler's lips pressed into a thin line. The interrogation was far from over. The room was charged with tension. The flickering glow of the drawing-room's chandelier cast shadows over the assembled servants, their faces pale in the dim light. At the centre of it all stood Mr. Graves, the butler, his stiff posture and clenched jaw revealing a man struggling to maintain composure. Holmes had played his moves skillfully. The moment he presented the ledger from the chapel, Graves had reacted, a flicker of recognition in his usually impassive expression. It was enough. Holmes adjusted his coat and turned toward the butler, his voice smooth yet edged with steel. "Mr. Graves, you can save us all a great deal of time by explaining how you are connected to the Tapestry Society." Graves said nothing. The other servants exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Mr. Graves, you've served this family for almost 40 years. If you know something about Theodore, please, tell us." Still, Graves remained silent. Holmes's keen eyes studied the butler for a long moment. Then, without warning, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "If you do not speak, Mr. Graves, I shall be forced to deduce the truth aloud, and I assure you, I will not be kind." Graves's throat bobbed, but his lips remained pressed into a firm line. Holmes smiled thinly. "Very well." He turned slightly, adjusting his gloves. "Let us consider the facts." Holmes began pacing, his words measured. "Mr. Graves has served the Bancroft family for nearly 4 decades. In that time, he has undoubtedly witnessed many secrets, but has spoken of none." He glanced toward Eleanor. "Miss Bancroft, you once told me that your great-grandfather expanded this estate." "Yes." "Yes," she said, nodding. "He commissioned renovations to the manor and the surrounding lands." "Precisely." Holmes turned to Graves. "And tell me, Mr. Graves, were you here during those renovations?" Graves hesitated, then gave a curt nod. I was. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then you knew about the hidden chamber beneath the chapel. A murmur ran through the servants. Graves's expression remained carefully neutral. Let us go further, Holmes continued. You were aware of something. Perhaps not everything, but enough to know Theodore was in danger. And yet, you said nothing. Graves exhaled sharply through his nose. Holmes's voice lowered to a whisper. The real question is, why? Graves stared at him, his jaw tight. Then at last he spoke. Because I was told to keep silent. Eleanor gasped. Holmes's expression did not change. By whom? Graves did not answer immediately. His gaze flickered toward the window, as if expecting someone or something to be watching. Then at last he muttered. A visitor came to see Master Theodore 2 nights before he vanished. The room fell deathly silent. Holmes's eyes narrowed sharply. A visitor? Graves nodded. A man. He arrived at midnight, alone. He spoke with Master Theodore in his study. I was not privy to their conversation. But when the man left, Master Theodore was not the same. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Who was he? Graves hesitated. Holmes stepped forward. Tell us. Graves exhaled slowly, as if resigning himself to the inevitable. He gave no name, the butler said at last, but he wore white gloves. A chill settled over the room. Holmes remained perfectly still, his gaze locked onto the butler. White gloves, he repeated, almost absently. Yes, Graves confirmed. I recall that distinctly. His coat was dark, but his gloves white, almost pristine. Eleanor shuddered. What does that mean? Holmes's fingers tapped once against his forearm. It means, Miss Bancroft, that your brother was visited by someone who did not wish to be identified. I frowned. But why white gloves? Holmes turned to me. A simple way to avoid leaving fingerprints, Watson. And more than that. He paused, as though turning over a revelation in his mind. Watson, he said suddenly, do you recall our discussion of the Tapestry Society? The theory that this is not one person, but a network? I nodded slowly. Yes. Holmes exhaled. Then I believe we may have just uncovered their calling card. Eleanor stiffened. You mean, the white gloves are a symbol? Precisely, Holmes murmured. We are dealing with individuals who erase their own presence. No names, no traces. And yet, a pattern emerges. His gaze turned back to Graves. You saw his face. Graves shook his head. No, sir. He remained in the shadows. Holmes exhaled sharply. Of course he did. I cleared my throat. But Graves, tell me, did Theodore seem afraid after this meeting, or was he willing? Graves hesitated. He was troubled, the butler admitted, but not afraid. I believe the man offered him a choice. And Master Theodore accepted. Eleanor let out a choked gasp. Then he left willingly. Graves looked away. I do not know, miss. Holmes turned to Eleanor. This explains why he had Mary Simmons lock his door from the outside. He was waiting for something, expecting something. Holmes's voice lowered, and when the time came, he went to them. Holmes strode toward the fireplace, his eyes gleaming with renewed purpose. We must find this man in white gloves. If he was sent by the Tapestry Society, then he holds the key to Theodore's disappearance. Eleanor's fists clenched. How do we find him? Holmes smiled slightly. By following his trail. He turned back to Graves. This visitor, how did he arrive? Graves frowned. A carriage brought him. I saw it waiting beyond the gates. Holmes's expression sharpened. And where did it go when it left? Graves hesitated. I do not know, sir. Holmes exhaled. Then we must track it. He turned to me, his voice brimming with certainty. Watson, we are going to London. I blinked. London? Holmes nodded. If a stranger in white gloves came here, then he came from somewhere. There are eyes and ears in the city, and I intend to use them. Eleanor gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white. Do you think he took Theodore there? Holmes's expression darkened. I think, Miss Bancroft, that Theodore was taken wherever the Tapestry wanted him. He reached for his coat. And we are going to find out where. The following morning, Holmes and I set out for London, leaving the oppressive gloom of Bancroft Manor behind us. Eleanor Bancroft remained at the estate, though her anxiety was evident as she watched us depart. Holmes, for his part, was uncharacteristically quiet during the journey. Seated across from me in the train carriage, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze remained fixed upon the rolling countryside beyond the window. Holmes, I said at last, lowering my newspaper, you have been silent for the past hour. I suspect your mind is already far ahead of our arrival. Holmes blinked, as if momentarily returning from some distant thought. Indeed, Watson, we are now entering a different battlefield, one where our opponent knows we are coming. I frowned. Then do you truly believe we are being watched? Holmes smiled faintly. Watson, we were being watched before we even knew there was a game being played. I suppressed a shiver. And yet you remain determined to walk straight into the lion's den. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Not at all, my dear Watson. The trick is to ensure that the lion does not know which direction we shall strike from. The train whistled as we approached the city, steam billowing past the windows. We were returning to London, and somewhere in its streets, the man in white gloves awaited us. As evening fell, Holmes led me through the tangled alleys of Southwark, where London's criminal underworld thrived in the shadows. We moved through fog-drenched streets, past dimly lit taverns where the scent of cheap gin lingered in the air. It was here, among the city's lowest, that Holmes's network of informants proved invaluable. At last, we arrived at a dingy public house along the Thames, the Black Swan Tavern. Holmes glanced at me. Watson, remain alert. We are about to speak with a man who has more enemies than friends. Inside, the tavern was thick with smoke, filled with dock workers, gamblers, and men who valued their secrets. At a small table near the back sat a thin man with sharp features, his coat patched, his fingers ink-stained. Holmes approached smoothly. Ah, Raven, I trust the streets have not been too unkind to you. The man looked up, his expression cautious. Holmes, he muttered, you don't usually come knocking unless there's a storm brewing. Holmes sat. Indeed, and tonight I find myself in need of a certain piece of information. Raven smirked. And what might that be? Holmes leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. A man arrived in the countryside near Bancroft Manor 2 nights before Theodore Bancroft vanished. He came by carriage, alone. He wore white gloves. A sudden silence fell over the table. Raven's face twitched. You're playing a dangerous hand, Holmes. Holmes's expression did not waver. Then I take it you know something. Raven exhaled sharply. I know who you're looking for, but the question is, do you truly want to find him? Holmes's fingers tapped against the table. Enlighten me. Raven glanced around, then leaned in. There's been talk, whispers of men who leave no trace behind. No names, no pasts, only a mark. I frowned. A mark? Raven nodded. They call themselves the White Glove Society, a group of men who specialize in removing things from history, people, knowledge, objects. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And this man in white gloves? Raven sighed. If he's who I think he is, you'll find him in Mayfair at a private club called the Elysian Room. It's a gentleman's establishment, but it ain't about cards or drink, Holmes. It's about power. Holmes exhaled softly. I see. Raven hesitated. You'd best be careful. Those who go looking for the White Glove Society. He trailed off. They don't always return. Holmes smiled faintly. Then it is fortunate that I have no intention of going alone. I shifted uneasily. Holmes, I presume you're referring to me? Holmes clapped me on the shoulder. Indeed, Watson. We shall go together, two gentlemen in need of fine company and finer conversation. I groaned. And what shall we do once we find this man? Holmes's expression darkened. We shall ask him exactly what became of Theodore Bancroft. Later that night, dressed in formal evening wear, Holmes and I arrived in Mayfair, where the cobbled streets were lined with gas lamps and polished carriages. The Elysian Room was a grand yet unassuming building, its entrance marked by two marble pillars. The doorman, clad in a dark tailcoat, regarded us with careful scrutiny. Your names, sirs? Holmes smiled charmingly. Mr. Sigerson and Dr. Werner. I barely concealed my surprise at the pseudonyms. The doorman studied us a moment longer, then nodded, stepping aside. We entered a world of low laughter, cigar smoke, and the murmur of hushed dealings. Holmes whispered, Now, Watson, we must find our man. I scanned the room, my gaze catching on a lone figure seated near the fireplace. He was dressed impeccably, his hands clad in white gloves. Holmes followed my gaze and smiled coldly. Ah, I do believe we have found him. The Elysian Room exuded an air of exclusivity that even the most opulent gentlemen's clubs in London would envy. The lighting was subdued, casting an intimate glow upon the rich mahogany-panelled walls, where whispers and clandestine dealings floated through the air like smoke from expensive cigars. At the far end of the lavishly furnished drawing room, seated in an ornate leather chair near the fireplace, was our man. He was impeccably dressed, his tailored black suit adorned with silver cufflinks. But it was his hands that seized my attention, encased in pristine white gloves, fingers idly tapping against the rim of a crystal tumbler filled with brandy. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. This was our quarry. Holmes adjusted his cuff and whispered, Watson, observe closely. He knows we are coming. And indeed, as we approached, the man in white gloves lifted his glass in mock acknowledgement, his lips curving in amusement. Holmes offered his own polite nod and slid gracefully into the opposite chair, leaving me to stand at his side like an ever-watchful sentinel. The man regarded us with cool detachment, his eyes sharp, yet unreadable. I must say, he murmured, his voice smooth as silk. Few men possess the audacity to seek me out, and yet here you are, Mr. Holmes. I stiffened. He knew Holmes's name. Holmes, however, remained unfazed. He reached for the cigar box on the table, selected one, and began rolling it absently between his fingers. Audacity is such a strong word, he mused. Let us call it curiosity instead. The man chuckled, swirling his brandy. Ah, but curiosity can be a dangerous affliction in certain circles. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Then let us dispense with riddles. I believe you visited Theodore Bancroft 2 nights before his disappearance. The man's fingers paused mid-tap against the tumbler. Then, with studied ease, he took a slow sip of his drink and set it down. Perhaps, he said simply. Holmes's gaze sharpened. You delivered a message to him, a proposition if I were to guess, and now he is missing. The man exhaled softly through his nose, as if mildly amused. And tell me, Mr. Holmes, why do you care so much? Holmes smiled slightly. Let us say that I take a personal interest in cases where young men vanish under peculiar circumstances. The man tilted his head. A noble sentiment. But tell me, are you certain that Theodore Bancroft was taken? My stomach tightened at his words. Holmes, however, remained motionless. Enlighten me. The man studied Holmes for a long moment, as if weighing a decision. Then, with exquisite control, he lifted his gloved hand and plucked a single envelope from his coat pocket. He set it down on the table between them. Holmes did not move to take it. The man smiled faintly. A gift. Consider it. A breadcrumb. Holmes's eyes darkened with interest. And what, pray, is the cost of such a gift? The man leaned back, his fingers steepling beneath his chin. Only this, he murmured. Walk away. A tense silence settled over the table. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the space between us. Holmes studied the sealed envelope, his expression unreadable. Then, with excruciating slowness, he reached forward, his fingertips brushing against the paper. And then, he stopped. He looked up sharply, his gaze locking onto the man's own. You speak as though you have authority over this matter, Holmes murmured. The man gave a ghost of a smile. I speak as one who has seen what happens to men who dig too deep. Holmes exhaled. And you would rather I abandon my inquiry? Yes, the man said simply. Holmes sat back, contemplating him. And yet, you have given me this letter. A contradiction, wouldn't you say? The man's smile did not falter. I am merely offering you a choice. Knowledge comes with a price, Mr. Holmes. You must decide if you are willing to pay it. Holmes held his gaze for a long moment. Then at last, he lifted the envelope and tucked it into his coat. I suppose we shall see, he murmured. The man in white gloves inclined his head slightly. Indeed. Then, with an air of finality, he rose from his chair. Holmes did not move. The man adjusted his gloves, smoothing them meticulously over his fingers. Enjoy the letter, Mr. Holmes, he said, but do tread carefully. With that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the velvet-curtained exit, disappearing into the shadows of the Elysian room. The moment we stepped outside, Holmes wasted no time. He tore open the envelope, his fingers quick and precise, revealing a single slip of parchment. Scrawled in elegant handwriting were 3 words: Seek the archive. Holmes's jaw tightened. I exhaled. What does it mean? Holmes turned the slip over, examining the back. There, in small script, was an address. 34 Chancery Lane, London. Holmes's fingers tightened around the paper. Watson, he said quietly. Yes? We are about to discover what it is the Tapestry Society does not want the world to know. His voice dropped to a whisper. And I suspect Theodore Bancroft found it first. The night air was cold as Holmes and I stood beneath a flickering gas lamp on Chancery Lane, studying the slip of parchment once more. Seek the archive, and beneath it, an address, 34 Chancery Lane, London. Holmes tapped the paper against his gloved fingers, his sharp gaze scanning the street. The buildings lining the lane were a mix of legal offices, old records halls, and private establishments, their windows dark at this late hour. Holmes, I murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Do you believe our friend in white gloves meant for us to find this place? Holmes's lips curled faintly. I believe, Watson, that he meant for us to choose whether we would find it. He turned, his coat billowing slightly in the night wind. Come, let us see what secrets Chancery Lane is hiding. The building in question was a narrow, unassuming structure wedged between 2 solicitors' offices. Its stone facade was weathered, the wooden door marked only with a brass number, 34. There were no business signs, no lanterns to indicate it was occupied. It looked abandoned. Holmes ran his fingers along the doorframe, his keen gaze noting the lack of dust on the handle. It is not as empty as it seems, he murmured. Someone has been here recently. Before I could respond, he tried the door handle. It did not move. Locked. Holmes produced a set of thin metal tools from his coat. With practiced precision, he inserted them into the keyhole, his fingers moving deftly. A few seconds later, a faint click. The door swung open. "After you, Watson," Holmes whispered, stepping aside. Suppressing my unease, I followed him into the darkness beyond. The interior was cool and silent, the faint scent of aged parchment filling the air. We stood in a long, narrow corridor, its wooden floorboards creaking beneath our weight. To the left and right, tall shelves lined with books and ledgers stretched toward the ceiling. At the far end of the corridor, a single desk and oil lamp sat untouched. "A library," I whispered. Holmes nodded, his fingers grazing the book spines. "Not just any library, Watson. This is an archive." I frowned. "An archive of what?" Holmes did not immediately respond. Instead, he pulled a random volume from the shelf, its leather cover cracked with age. He flipped through the brittle pages, his expression darkening. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes turned the book toward me. The pages were filled with names, dates, and cryptic annotations. Some names were crossed out. Others were marked with symbols I did not recognize. "This is not an archive of law," Holmes murmured. "This is a record of disappearances," I inhaled sharply. "You mean people," Holmes said softly. "People who have been erased." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "And Theodore Bancroft?" Holmes's fingers flipped through the pages, moving swiftly. He paused near the end of the book, and then he found it. Theodore Bancroft. Beside his name, a single notation: initiated, pending resolution. Eleanor's brother had been marked. I clenched my fists. "What does that mean?" Holmes's jaw tightened. "It means Theodore was not merely taken. He was processed, examined. And if this record is correct," his voice lowered dangerously, "he is still alive." A sudden noise shattered the silence, a faint click, like the shifting of weight against old wood. Holmes's gaze snapped upward. "Watson," he whispered, "we are not alone." I instinctively reached for my revolver, my heart hammering. Holmes set the book down carefully, his ears straining. Then, another sound. This time, it came from behind the shelves. Holmes moved swiftly, running his fingers along the edge of one of the tall bookshelves. His finger stopped near the base. He pressed lightly. A mechanical click. Before my very eyes, the entire bookcase shifted inward, revealing a narrow stone passageway beyond. My breath caught. "Holmes!" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I suspect we have just found where the archive truly begins." Without another word, he stepped inside. I hesitated only a moment before following him into the darkness below. The stone passage sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. Faint torches lined the walls, their flames flickering weakly, as if long unattended. After what felt like several minutes of descent, we stepped into a vast underground chamber. The sight that met us stole the breath from my lungs. The room was lined with stone pillars, their surfaces engraved with symbols identical to those on the Bancroft Tapestry. Along the far wall stood rows of wooden cabinets, each containing sealed documents, books and ledgers. But it was the massive mural at the chamber's centre that held me frozen. A single woven knot was carved into the wall, larger than any we had seen before. Beneath it, inscribed in Latin, were the words "Veritas obscura, quicerit, perit," Holmes translated softly. "The hidden truth, those who seek it, perish." A shiver ran down my spine. Holmes, however, seemed utterly unfazed. He strode toward the nearest wooden cabinet, pulling it open. Inside were dozens of sealed letters, each bearing the same wax seal, the woven knot. Holmes picked up one dated only weeks prior. He broke the seal and scanned the letter. His expression darkened. I stepped closer. "What does it say?" Holmes's voice was low and unreadable. "It is a message, a directive sent to Theodore Bancroft." He turned the paper so I could see. The message contained only one chilling line. "Your induction nears. Do not resist the pattern." I exhaled sharply. This is a recruitment letter." Holmes nodded grimly. "Yes, Watson. And I suspect this is what the Tapestry Society does." I swallowed. "They don't just erase people. They change them." Holmes tucked the letter into his coat. "We must leave. We have learned enough for now." I nodded, feeling deeply unsettled. But as we turned to go, a sound echoed from the tunnel behind us. A soft, measured footstep. Then another, and another. Holmes went rigid. We were no longer alone. A measured footstep echoed through the underground chamber, reverberating off the ancient stone walls. Holmes and I froze, our senses razor-sharp. The dancing torchlight cast shifting shadows upon the pillar-lined chamber, distorting the space, making it impossible to tell how many intruders lurked in the darkness. Then another step, and another, slow, deliberate. Holmes's fingers tightened around the letter he had just taken from the archive. "Watson," he whispered, barely moving his lips. "When I give the word, extinguish the torch nearest to you." I nodded, gripping the brass torch holder beside me. My other hand reached instinctively for my revolver. Holmes took a step forward, his voice cool and unshaken. "You may as well step into the light," he called out. "There is little point in prolonging the inevitable." A silence. For a moment, I thought whoever had been following us might remain hidden. Then, from the far archway, a figure emerged. He was tall and gaunt, draped in a long black coat, his posture rigid as a statue. The low torchlight illuminated his face, a sharp, angular visage with deep-set eyes, staring at us with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming. But it was his gloved hands that seized my attention. White gloves, just like the man from the Elysian room. Holmes gave a slight tilt of his head. "I take it you are not merely a caretaker of this archive." The man's lips curled faintly, though there was no humour in the gesture. "No, Mr. Holmes. I am its guardian." His voice was smooth, deliberate, as if every word had been chosen with meticulous precision. Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "And what, pray, does a guardian do?" The man took another measured step forward. "I ensure that knowledge does not fall into the wrong hands." Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the parchment he held. "Fascinating. And I suppose you consider our hands unworthy?" The guardian's gaze darkened. "You do not understand what you are tampering with." Holmes's lips twitched slightly. "On the contrary, I understand more than you might think. Theodore Bancroft was marked for induction. But what is the Tapestry inducting him into?" The guardian's face remained impassive. Holmes stepped closer. "The knowledge in this archive is dangerous, is it not?" Silence. Holmes pressed on. "The Tapestry Society does not merely erase individuals. It absorbs them, shapes them, rewrites them." The guardian's jaw tightened. Holmes's voice dropped. "What did you do to Theodore Bancroft?" For the first time, something flickered across the guardian's expression. Not anger, not menace, but hesitation. And that was all the confirmation Holmes needed. Holmes turned his attention back to the shelves. "There is something here, something so important that you have spent decades ensuring it remains hidden." The guardian remained silent. Holmes reached for another sealed envelope, and this time, when he broke the wax seal, something dropped out onto the stone floor. A brass cipher disc. Holmes crouched, picking it up carefully. The device was intricately carved, marked with letters and symbols that did not belong to any standard alphabet. My breath caught. "Holmes, that is not English." Holmes turned it over, studying the markings carefully. "Not just a cipher, Watson," he murmured. "A key." His gaze snapped up to the Guardian. "This is what Theodore was looking for, wasn't it?" The Guardian remained stone-faced. Holmes turned the device over in his fingers. This cipher was designed to unlock something important. I exhaled. "But what?" Holmes's gaze gleamed. "The true purpose of the Tapestry Society." The Guardian's expression shifted, for the first time, a trace of concern. Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, I see we are finally approaching the truth." The Guardian inhaled sharply. "You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes." Holmes pocketed the cipher disk. "Yes," he murmured. "You people do seem to say that rather often." Before the Guardian could react, a new sound echoed from the entrance of the chamber. The soft, deliberate clack of boots on stone. Holmes stiffened. "Watson." I turned sharply, my hand tightening around my revolver. A second figure stood in the entryway now, partially shrouded in shadow. He was taller than the Guardian, broader, with a presence that seemed to command the very air around him. Then, he stepped into the light. My stomach lurched. I knew this man, and so did Holmes. He was the same man from the Elysian room, the man in white gloves. The new arrival regarded us with mild amusement, his gloved fingers adjusting the cuff of his coat. "You are nothing if not persistent, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "Persistence is a virtue in my profession." The man in white gloves tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze flickering toward the Guardian. "Leave us." The Guardian hesitated. The man's voice dropped, a command, not a request. "Now." The Guardian hesitated only a moment longer before bowing his head and stepping back into the darkness. Holmes exhaled softly. "A man of authority, I see." The stranger smiled faintly. "Merely a messenger." Holmes's voice lowered. "And what message do you bring?" The man leaned in slightly. "Walk away, Holmes. This does not concern you." Holmes's fingers curled around the cipher disk in his pocket. "And if I do not?" The man sighed, as if disappointed rather than angry. "Then you will not like what happens next." Silence fell. Holmes's lips curled slightly, his eyes gleaming with something between curiosity and defiance. "Then I suppose I must disappoint you," he murmured. The man in white gloves studied him for a long moment. Then, at last, he smiled. "A pity," he said. "I rather liked you." And with that, he turned on his heel and vanished into the shadows. Holmes and I stood there, unmoving, the weight of the unspoken threat settling over us like a cold fog. Holmes exhaled slowly. "Watson," he murmured. "I believe we have just been given a final warning." I swallowed. "And what do we do with warnings, Holmes?" Holmes smiled faintly. "We ignore them, of course." And with that, we turned and left the archive behind. We had a cipher to solve, and time was running out. As we emerged from 34 Chancery Lane, stepping into the cold London night, I could not shake the feeling that we had ventured too far into dangerous territory. Holmes, however, seemed energized, his mind already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of our mystery. The brass cipher disk, now securely tucked in his coat pocket, held the key to unravelling the Tapestry Society's secrets. I exhaled, glancing over my shoulder. "Holmes, do you think they will let us leave so easily?" Holmes's expression was unreadable. "No, Watson," he murmured. "I suspect they are watching us at this very moment." I stiffened. "Then should we not move cautiously?" Holmes smiled faintly, his eyes gleaming in the gaslight. Caution is a fine thing, Watson, but curiosity is better. With that, he hailed a cab, stepping inside as though we had just left an evening lecture at the Royal Academy. I followed warily. Where are we going? Holmes tapped his fingers against his knee. 221B Baker Street, Watson. I frowned. You mean to solve the cipher tonight? Holmes's smile widened. Of course, my dear fellow. He leaned back, closing his eyes. After all, mysteries do not solve themselves. The familiar warmth of our sitting room was a welcome contrast to the night's chill. Mrs. Hudson had already retired, leaving Holmes and me alone with our work. Holmes wasted no time. He set the brass cipher disc upon the table, along with the letter from the archive and several sheets of blank parchment. I poured myself a stiff brandy, watching as he examined the device under the lamplight. The disc was composed of 2 concentric circles, the outer ring engraved with letters, while the inner ring bore cryptic symbols, many of which I did not recognize. Holmes turned it slowly in his fingers, his gaze flickering with excitement. Watson, he murmured, this is no ordinary cipher. I exhaled. That much is obvious, Holmes, but what does it unlock? Holmes did not immediately answer. Instead, he reached for a piece of charcoal and began sketching the symbols from the disc onto paper, comparing them with the cryptic markings we had seen in the archive. Then, he paused. His fingers hovered over one particular symbol. I leaned in. Holmes? His voice was quiet. This is a cipher within a cipher. I frowned. What do you mean? Holmes turned the inner ring, aligning the unfamiliar symbols with the English letters. Slowly, a word emerged. Holmes's sharp intake of breath told me he had found something significant. I peered over his shoulder, reading the deciphered letters aloud. M-I-R-R-O-R. I blinked. Mirror. Holmes sat back, steepling his fingers. Indeed, Watson, this is a mirrored cipher. The message is hidden within reflected words. He adjusted the alignment again, this time writing down the new set of letters. We watched as the next word appeared. D-O-O-R. My breath caught. Mirror, door. Holmes's voice was barely above a whisper. This cipher is directing us to a hidden entrance. At dawn, we were once again on the road, this time bound for Bancroft Manor. Holmes had sent an urgent telegram to Eleanor, instructing her to meet us upon our arrival. The carriage ride was silent, save for the occasional clatter of wheels upon cobblestone. Holmes sat deep in thought, the cipher disc clutched between his fingers. Finally, I could endure the suspense no longer. Holmes, do you believe Theodore was taken through a hidden passage? Holmes exhaled. I believe, Watson, that Theodore entered it willingly. I stiffened. You mean? Holmes's voice was grim. I mean that Theodore was given a choice, and he took it. Before I could press him further, the manor gates loomed into view. Eleanor was already waiting at the entrance, her eyes wide with worry. Mr. Holmes, she called as we stepped from the carriage. What have you found? Holmes lifted the cipher disc, turning it so the morning light gleamed upon its engravings. A door, he said. A hidden entrance. And I believe it is somewhere within this house. Eleanor paled. But where? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Where do you keep your mirrors, Miss Bancroft? Eleanor hesitated, her brow furrowing. There are many, but the largest is in the great hall. It has been there for generations. Holmes nodded. Then that is where we shall begin. The great hall of Bancroft Manor was an imposing space, lined with portraits of ancestors long past, their watchful eyes seeming to track our movements. At its centre stood a massive gilded mirror, spanning nearly floor to ceiling. The frame was adorned with intricate carvings, including... My breath caught. At the very top of the frame, barely noticeable. The woven knot symbol. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, there you are. Eleanor stared at the knot engraving, her expression one of shock. I never noticed that before. Holmes approached the mirror, studying its edges carefully. Then, with slow deliberation, he reached into his coat and retrieved a brass cipher disc. With great precision, he aligned the inner circle to match the mirror's engravings. A soft click echoed through the hall. Then, a section of the mirror frame shifted inward, revealing a hidden keyhole. Eleanor gasped. My God! Holmes withdrew a small brass key, the very one we had found in Theodore's desk on our first night here. With a calm hand, he inserted it into the lock and turned it. A deep grinding noise rumbled through the chamber. Then, the mirror swung open, revealing a darkened passage beyond. Eleanor clutched my arm. It's real. Holmes exhaled slowly. Indeed, Miss Bancroft. He stepped forward, peering into the darkness beyond the threshold. Now, he murmured, let us see what secrets Theodore was meant to find. And with that, we crossed the threshold into the unknown. A thick, damp air drifted from the darkened passageway. It sent a mixture of aged stone, decayed wood, and something more elusive, something forgotten. Holmes lifted the lantern he had retrieved from the hall and stepped forward without hesitation. The flickering light stretched long shadows across the cold stone walls, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into the earth. Eleanor clutched my arm, her breathing shallow. I had no idea such a place existed, she whispered. Holmes glanced back at her. Few do, Miss Bancroft, and fewer still have ever left it once they entered. I swallowed hard. Reassuring as always, Holmes. He only smiled faintly and began the descent. With Eleanor at my side, I followed, our footsteps echoing ominously as we wound deeper and deeper beneath Bancroft Manor. Whatever lay below had been hidden for generations, and Theodore Bancroft had ventured down these very steps before us. At last, the stairway ended, depositing us into a long, arched tunnel, its walls lined with ancient wooden beams for support. Dust swirled in the air, disturbed only by our passage. Holmes held the lantern high, his sharp gaze sweeping over the surroundings. This tunnel was reinforced, likely centuries ago. Someone intended for it to endure. Eleanor gripped her shawl tightly. But why? And where does it lead? Holmes studied the stonework, his fingers brushing over a series of symbols carved into the walls, the same symbols we had seen in the archive beneath Chancery Lane. Holmes exhaled. Watson, do you recall the inscription we found below London? I nodded. Veritas obscura. Qui querit. Perit. Holmes murmured. The hidden truth. Those who seek it perish. Eleanor shivered. Are you suggesting my family was involved in whatever this is? Holmes gave a slight nod. Not just involved, Miss Bancroft. Your ancestors built this place. I stiffened. But what exactly is this place, Holmes? Holmes turned, his gaze locked onto the far end of the corridor. Let us find out, Watson. With that, he strode forward. After a few minutes of walking, we reached a massive iron door embedded into the stone. It was marked with a single emblem, the woven knot. Eleanor inhaled sharply. The same symbol on Theodore's letters. Holmes ran his fingers along the edges of the door, searching for a mechanism. Indeed, but this is not merely a door, Miss Bancroft. This is a threshold. A threshold, I echoed. Holmes stepped back. Only those deemed worthy were meant to pass through it. I exhaled. And how precisely do we convince the door of our worth? Holmes smiled faintly. By using the cipher disc. Eleanor's eyes widened. You mean... Holmes produced the brass cipher disc, aligning its rings carefully. The moment he turned it to match the woven knot engraving, a deep click echoed through the corridor. The iron door trembled. Then, with a slow, grating groan, it unlocked and swung open. A blast of cold air met us from within. Holmes stepped forward, lantern in hand. "Shall we?" Beyond the door lay a circular stone chamber, its walls lined with bookshelves, cabinets, and ancient scrolls. The air was thick with dust and secrecy, the scent of parchment and wax filling my lungs. At the centre of the room stood a long wooden table, upon which lay a series of aged documents carefully arranged. Eleanor gasped. "This is a library." Holmes stepped forward, scanning the parchments carefully. "This is not a library, Miss Bancroft," he murmured. "This is a record of indoctrination." I frowned. "Indoctrination?" Holmes gestured toward the nearest document. It was a ledger, nearly identical to the one we had found in the archive, and at the bottom of the most recent entry was the name Theodore Bancroft. Eleanor let out a small cry. He was here." Holmes's gaze darkened. "Yes, and he was not alone." He turned to the far side of the chamber, where another door stood ajar. Beyond it, a second passage descended into even deeper darkness. Holmes met my gaze. "Watson, I suspect this is where Theodore went next." I clenched my fists. "Then we follow him." Holmes nodded. "Precisely." With that, we stepped through the second threshold, into the unknown. The deeper we descended, the colder and heavier the air became, thick with the weight of secrets buried for generations. Holmes carried the lantern, its flickering glow casting eerie shadows along the rough stone walls of the corridor. Eleanor's breathing was uneven beside me. I could not blame her. Even I, who had seen many strange things in my years with Holmes, felt an unnatural foreboding as we stepped deeper into the abyss beneath Bancroft Manor. Holmes, as always, was undaunted. If anything, he seemed invigorated, his keen eyes scanning every inch of our surroundings. "This passage was not meant to be found," he murmured. And yet, someone ensured that Theodore discovered it. Eleanor swallowed. "Then he came this way?" Holmes nodded. "Undoubtedly, and if I am correct, we are about to learn why." At last, the corridor opened into a vast underground chamber, and there, at its centre, we saw it. A stone dais, raised upon a circular platform, inscribed with the woven knot symbol of the Tapestry Society. Surrounding it were 6 robed figures, standing motionless, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods. And kneeling at the centre of the dais, Theodore Bancroft. Eleanor gasped, stepping forward before I could stop her. "Theodore!" The moment her voice rang out, the figures turned as one. A chill ran down my spine. Their movements were unnatural, too smooth, too synchronized, as though they were not entirely human. Holmes remained perfectly still, his fingers tightened around his cane. Then, from the group, one figure stepped forward. He was taller than the rest, his robes embroidered with silver thread, the only distinguishing mark of his authority. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured, and deliberate. "You should not have come here." Holmes tilted his head slightly. "I do find that people have a tendency to tell me that." The hooded figure did not react. "Leave now. This does not concern you." Holmes's gaze flickered toward Theodore, still kneeling upon the dais, his head bowed. He appeared conscious but eerily still, as though caught in some trance. "It concerns us greatly," Holmes said smoothly. "Theodore Bancroft is not yours to take." The figure stepped forward. "He is not being taken," he said. "He is being transformed." Eleanor clutched my arm. "What does that mean?" Holmes's voice was quiet. "It means, Miss Bancroft, that your brother is undergoing an initiation." The figure nodded. Correct. And once the process is complete, he will no longer be the man you knew. Eleanor paled. No, I won't let this happen. She moved to rush forward, but Holmes caught her wrist. Wait, he murmured. Not yet. The hooded figure turned toward Theodore, lifting a hand. The final stage must now begin. Holmes's voice hardened. You will not touch him. The figure finally turned his full attention to Holmes. And what will you do to stop us, detective? Holmes's smile was sharp and knowing. You assume I came unprepared. The hooded figure remained silent. Holmes continued, his tone casual. Let us consider the facts. You lured Theodore Bancroft here. You subjected him to a ritual of indoctrination, and now you intend to strip away his identity completely. Holmes stepped closer. I suspect, however, that you require one thing before that process can be completed. The hooded figure did not respond. Holmes smiled. His consent. Eleanor inhaled sharply. Holmes nodded. Yes, that is why you have not forced him. This transformation requires a willing mind, does it not? A long silence followed. Then, at last, the hooded figure spoke. You understand more than most, Mr. Holmes. Holmes's expression did not change. I make it my business to understand. The figure lowered his hood, revealing a face lined with age, but sharp and watchful, his eyes filled with unnatural clarity. He was not just any follower. He was a leader of the Tapestry Society. My name is Lucian Vale, he said, and you, Mr. Holmes, have just meddled in something far beyond your reckoning. Holmes's expression remained neutral, but I knew him well enough to recognize the shift in his posture. He was calculating his next move. Lucian Vale turned to Theodore, who remained motionless on the dais. Theodore Bancroft, he said, the moment has come. You must choose. Will you continue as you were, or will you step into the design of the tapestry? Eleanor struggled against my grip. Theodore, don't listen to him. They're trying to control you. Theodore finally lifted his head, and what I saw sent a shiver through me. His eyes were blank, his expression detached, as if he were caught between two worlds. Holmes studied him carefully. Then, he did something unexpected. He took the cipher disk from his pocket and threw it onto the dais. It landed with a sharp clang. Lucian Vale's eyes darkened. Holmes's voice was quiet, but it carried through the chamber. Theodore Bancroft, he said, if you wish to choose for yourself, then prove it. Solve the cipher. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the hooded figures. Lucian Vale frowned. What is the meaning of this? Holmes remained calm. If he is to be transformed by knowledge, then let him show his understanding. Lucian Vale hesitated. Then he turned to Theodore. Very well, he said. Solve it. Theodore reached forward, his fingers brushing against the brass cipher disk. He lifted it slowly. The chamber was utterly silent as he began to turn the rings, aligning the symbols with deliberate precision. Holmes and I watched intently. Then, a soft click. The final alignment was complete. Theodore stared at it, his expression unreadable. Lucian Vale's voice was soft. And what does it say? Theodore whispered, break the pattern. Lucian Vale stiffened. Holmes smiled. Ah, I rather thought as much. Theodore suddenly gasped, as though waking from a dream. His eyes focused for the first time. Lucian Vale's face twisted. No, you were not meant to. Holmes moved like lightning. He grabbed Theodore's arm. Now, Watson! I fired my revolver into the air, sending a thunderous echo through the chamber. The hooded figures recoiled, and in the chaos, we ran. The moment the gunshot echoed through the chamber, chaos erupted. The hooded figures staggered back, momentarily disoriented by the deafening sound. The torchlight flickered wildly, casting elongated, shifting shadows across the stone walls. Holmes acted immediately, grabbing Theodore's arm and pulling him from the dais. "Watson! Eleanor! Move!" he barked. Eleanor sprinted forward, clutching my arm as I shoved my revolver back into my coat. Theodore was barely standing, as though waking from a long drugged slumber, his breath ragged and confused. Lucian Vale's furious voice rang out through the chamber. "Stop them!" At once, the hooded figures surged toward us. Holmes snatched a burning torch from the wall, swinging it in a wide arc. The nearest figure lurched back, the fire illuminating a glimpse of a pale, masked face beneath the hood. "This way!" Holmes commanded, dragging Theodore forward as we ran for the exit. We tore through the winding stone corridor, our hurried footsteps echoing in the suffocating darkness. Behind us, the Tapestry followers gave chase, their footsteps swift and relentless. "Theodore!" Eleanor gasped between ragged breaths. Are you all right?" Theodore stumbled, barely able to keep pace. I don't know where I am," he muttered. "I can't—" Holmes tightened his grip. "No time for explanations, Bancroft. You must run." A sharp whistle rang out behind us. Holmes swore under his breath. "They're signalling others. If we don't move faster, we'll be cut off." I gritted my teeth. "And where exactly are we running to, Holmes?" Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the tunnel. Then, suddenly, he veered left, pulling us into a narrow side passage. "Here." We followed blindly, plunging into the tighter corridor, our breaths ragged from exertion. Then, I saw why Holmes had chosen this path. Ahead, a wooden door stood partially ajar. Holmes shoved it open, revealing a dust-covered spiral staircase winding upward. "A hidden exit," he murmured. "We may just stand a chance." But before we could step inside, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead. A Tapestry follower, but not just any. Lucian Vale himself, and he was blocking our path. Holmes skidded to a halt, his lantern casting an eerie glow upon Vale's impassive face. "You cannot run forever, Mr. Holmes," Vale murmured. His tone was not angry. It was measured, knowing, as though he had anticipated this exact moment. Theodore shrank back, his eyes still clouded with lingering confusion. Eleanor gripped my arm tightly, her nails digging into my sleeve. Holmes, however, remained utterly calm. "Vale," he said smoothly, "I must commend you. Your patience is remarkable." Vale tilted his head slightly. "And yet, you refuse to listen." Holmes's lips curled faintly. "I find that blind obedience does not suit me." Vale sighed. "Then I offer you a final choice." He gestured toward Theodore. "Leave the boy. Walk away. You may all go free." Eleanor's breath hitched. "No." Holmes did not blink. "And if I refuse?" Vale's eyes darkened. "Then you will all remain here as part of the pattern." A chill ran through me. Holmes's gaze flickered to me, then to Theodore, then to Eleanor. Then, without warning, he moved. In a single fluid motion, Holmes lunged toward the nearest torch sconce and ripped it free from the wall. He turned mid-motion, hurling it directly at Vale. The flaming torch collided with the ancient wooden support beams behind him, setting them ablaze. For the first time, Vale's composure faltered. Holmes grabbed Theodore and shoved him through the door. "Run!" The fire licked rapidly up the wooden beams, embers falling in a shower of sparks. Vale snarled, stepping forward. But Holmes had already pulled the door shut. "Watson, bar it!" I slammed the iron latch down, locking it just as Vale's fist pounded against the wood from the other side. Holmes spun on his heel. Up the stairs. Now! We sprinted upward, Theodore half stumbling, Eleanor clutching his hand as we climbed the ancient stone spiral. The walls shuddered behind us. The fire was spreading, and the smell of burning wood grew stronger. Holmes led the way, his keen mind already calculating our next move. Then, a sliver of daylight. At the very top of the stairs, a trap door stood slightly ajar. Holmes threw it open, revealing the overcast morning sky above. He climbed out first, turning and reaching down to pull Eleanor and Theodore through. I scrambled up behind them, my pulse hammering. As I emerged, I realized we were outside the manor. We had surfaced in the old ruins behind Bancroft Manor, where crumbling stone foundations were all that remained of a long-lost structure. Holmes exhaled sharply, helping Theodore to his feet. "Watson," he said, "I believe it is time we depart." Behind us, the ground trembled as the hidden passage below began to collapse. We had barely escaped with our lives. And we staggered away from the ruins, catching our breath. Eleanor turned to Theodore, gripping his arms. "Theodore, say something." The young man blinked, as if waking from a deep sleep. He looked at her, then at Holmes. I remember," he murmured. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. "What happened to you?" Theodore swallowed hard. "They tried to show me something. They said I was part of the pattern. But when I solved the cipher, I saw—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I saw something I wasn't supposed to." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And what was that?" Theodore's gaze darkened. "The truth." Holmes exhaled softly. "Then we have much to discuss, Mr. Bancroft." I glanced over my shoulder at the burning ruins behind us. And I suspect the Tapestry Society will not take this loss lightly. Holmes smiled faintly. "Oh, I rather think they are just getting started, Watson." His expression grew distant. "We have pulled at a single thread," he murmured. "But the tapestry itself remains intact." Eleanor shivered. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I do not think, Miss Bancroft." He turned toward the road ahead. "I know they will." We had barely escaped the Tapestry Society's hidden chamber, but the weight of its secrets still pressed upon us. The morning air was crisp, yet a sense of unease lingered as we trudged away from the ruins behind Bancroft Manor, Theodore leaning heavily upon his sister. Holmes remained silent, his sharp gaze fixed on Theodore as if attempting to read the depths of his mind. At last, Eleanor could endure the silence no longer. "Theodore, please," she pleaded. "Tell us what they did to you. What did you see?" Theodore exhaled shakily, his eyes still distant, as though struggling to recall a half-forgotten dream. "They called it the pattern," he murmured. "They told me I had always been a part of it, that we all are." Holmes's expression did not change. "Go on." Theodore swallowed. "At first, I thought they were merely playing mind games, filling my head with riddles. But then—" his voice faltered, his fingers tightening into a fist. "I saw something, Holmes. Something terrible." Holmes stepped closer. "What did they show you, Theodore?" Theodore hesitated, his jaw clenching. "They made me look into a mirror," he said finally. "Not an ordinary mirror. It was ancient, framed in symbols like the ones on the tapestry. They called it the glass of memory." Eleanor shivered. "What does that mean?" Theodore ran a shaking hand through his hair. "They said it allows you to see before, to see the past, to see what was hidden." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what did you see?" Theodore inhaled sharply. "I saw myself." Eleanor stiffened. "Your reflection?" Theodore shook his head. Not just my reflection." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw myself in another time." A cold silence settled over the group. Holmes folded his arms. "Explain." Theodore shuddered. "I was in this very house, but it was different. The furniture, the clothing. I was wearing something old, something from centuries ago. And I wasn't alone. His breath came faster now. There were others, people dressed in robes just like the ones below, and in the center of it all was me. But I wasn't me, I was someone else, a man who had lived long before I was born. Eleanor gasped. That's impossible. Theodore gave a hollow laugh. That's what I thought too, but Holmes… His eyes locked onto the detective's. I could feel it. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a memory that didn't belong to me. Holmes exhaled, his gaze flickering with deep thought. And what was this memory showing you? Theodore's fingers dug into his palm. A ritual, a moment that had happened hundreds of years ago. But somehow, I was there. And the worst part is… He hesitated. Holmes leaned in slightly. Yes. Theodore's voice dropped to a whisper. I wasn't just an observer. Eleanor's breath hitched. What do you mean? Theodore swallowed. I was one of them. I was standing among them, chanting the same words. A chill ran down my spine. Holmes's expression darkened. Then the Tapestry Society is not merely inducting new members. Theodore nodded, his eyes haunted. They believe they are awakening old ones. Eleanor shook her head fiercely. No, that's madness. They filled your head with lies, Theodore. Theodore let out a shuddering breath. I wish that were true, Eleanor. His eyes flickered toward Holmes. But tell me, Holmes, have you ever felt it? Holmes raised an eyebrow. Felt what? Theodore's voice lowered. The sensation that you've been somewhere before, that you've done something before, even though you know you haven't. Holmes remained silent. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Not doubt, but something else, something deeper. Holmes sighed through his nose, as though pushing a thought aside. Very well, let us deal with what we do know. He withdrew the ledger we had taken from the hidden chamber beneath Chancery Lane. Flipping to the most recent page, he tapped Theodore's entry. Initiated, pending resolution. Theodore flinched. Holmes's voice was cool. It seems they were not yet finished with you, Bancroft, which means there is a process to their madness. He turned the pages, scanning further back. Then suddenly, he froze. His entire demeanor changed. I leaned in. Holmes? His fingers tightened slightly around the paper. Then, with deliberate precision, he turned the ledger toward us and pointed at a name. A name written among the initiated generations ago. A name I knew very well. Sherlock Holmes. I inhaled sharply. Eleanor clapped a hand over her mouth. No, but… how? Holmes remained absolutely still. His sharp grey eyes darkened, yet his expression did not betray a single thought. Theodore swallowed hard. Holmes, tell me you don't recognize it. Holmes's voice was dangerously soft. I recognize a great many things, Bancroft. I took the ledger from his hands, scanning the dates beside the entry. The year listed here is 1665, I muttered. That's over 200 years ago. I turned to Holmes. That's impossible. Holmes's fingers steepled in front of his lips. Indeed. His expression was unreadable. But for the first time since I had met him, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. The unfinished game. Holmes shut the ledger with a soft thud. This is not yet the end of our mystery, he murmured. Theodore's hands shook slightly. Holmes, if they were telling the truth, if this is real… Holmes turned sharply to him. It is not about what is real, Bancroft, he said. It is about what they want us to believe. Eleanor exhaled shakily. What do we do now? Holmes's expression hardened. We continue. We find out who controls the tapestry. We uncover their design. And we end this game before it can consume us. I swallowed. And what if it's too late? Holmes's gaze turned toward the rising morning sun. Then, softly, he said, "Watson, I fear we are playing a game whose rules I do not yet understand." Holmes had faced many puzzles in his career, unraveling the intricate threads of human deception, decoding cryptic messages, and exposing men who believed themselves untouchable. But never had I seen him pause, as he did now. The name in the ledger, Sherlock Holmes, written in a hand long dead, sat between us like a spectre from another age. Eleanor and Theodore watched Holmes carefully, searching for some reaction, some explanation. I swallowed hard. Holmes. What does this mean? Holmes's expression was unreadable. It means, Watson, that we have been misled. His voice was calm, but I detected a rare edge of hesitation beneath it. Eleanor exhaled sharply. But it's impossible. This ledger is centuries old. Holmes finally looked up, his grey eyes piercing. That is what makes it so interesting, Miss Bancroft. Then he stood abruptly, tossing the ledger onto the table. We need answers, and I know exactly where to begin. Holmes wasted no time. Within the hour, we were once again travelling toward London, bound for Chancery Lane, where the archive had first revealed its secrets. Theodore, still visibly unsteady, had refused to remain behind. Eleanor, though reluctant, had agreed that he needed to understand the truth as much as we did. As the carriage rattled over the cobbled streets, I turned to Holmes. Where precisely do you intend to look, Holmes? Holmes steepled his fingers. The archive, Watson. Someone recorded that name in the ledger. That means someone, somewhere, knows why. Theodore exhaled. And what if you don't like the answer? Holmes smiled faintly. That is precisely why I must ask the question. The narrow alley beside Chancery Lane was just as we had left it, dark, cold, and strangely silent. Holmes led the way, slipping through the side entrance of the archive, his movements quick and deliberate. We descended the dusty stairwell into the hidden chamber below, the air thick with the scent of old parchment. Holmes strode toward the wooden shelves, scanning them with hawk-like precision. Then, suddenly, he froze. I followed his gaze. A man was already there. He stood at one of the far bookshelves, dressed in a long dark coat, his gloved fingers tracing the spines of the ledgers. At the sound of our footsteps, he turned, and I felt my blood run cold. It was the same man from the Elysian room, the man in white gloves. A dangerous dialogue. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Holmes stepped forward, his tone light but deliberate. "Ah, you again. How very predictable." The man smiled faintly. "And yet you seem surprised." Holmes's gaze flickered toward the ledger the man had just set down. He moved before the stranger could stop him, picking it up with swift precision. He flipped it open. Then, his eyes narrowed. I leaned in, my breath catching as I read the name scrawled across the newest page. Sherlock Holmes, pending. A chill settled over the chamber. Holmes shut the book with a deliberate slowness, turning back to the man in white gloves. "You've been expecting me." The man inclined his head, in a manner of speaking. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice tight. "Who are you?" The man studied her with mild amusement. "You may call me Mr. Thorne." Holmes folded his arms. "And what, exactly, is your role in this grand game, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne tilted his head slightly. "I am merely a custodian of records, and on occasion, an observer of history." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "History, you say?" Thorne gestured toward the ledger still in Holmes's hands. "A history that repeats itself, Mr. Holmes." Theodore tensed beside me. Are you saying this has happened before? Thorne smiled. Has it not? Holmes remained impassive. Elaborate. Thorne stepped forward. You see patterns where others do not, Mr. Holmes. And yet you have not asked the most important question. Holmes arched an eyebrow. And that is? Thorne's voice was soft, measured. What if the pattern is not being created? He let the words settle, then continued. What if it is being remembered? A deep silence filled the chamber. Theodore shuddered. That's madness. Thorne smiled. Is it? He turned to Holmes. Tell me, detective, have you ever felt it? The sensation that you are not solving mysteries, but rather reliving them. For the first time, Holmes did not immediately reply. His fingers tapped once against the cover of the ledger. A long pause. Then, finally, Holmes spoke. I deal in facts, Mr. Thorne, not superstition. Thorne's smile did not fade. Then perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you should reconsider what constitutes a fact. He took a step back, adjusting the cuffs of his white gloves. You are already in the pattern, Mr. Holmes. The question is, will you finish what you started? Holmes's eyes gleamed. That depends, Mr. Thorne. What exactly did I start? Thorne tilted his head slightly, then simply said, You will know soon enough. Then, before we could stop him, he turned and vanished into the shadows of the archive. Holmes stared at the empty space where Thorne had stood. His jaw tightened ever so slightly. Eleanor let out a breath. What does this mean, Holmes? Holmes turned the ledger in his hands. His own name stared back at him. Sherlock Holmes. Pending. His fingers traced the words absently. Then, without another word, he shut the book firmly and turned toward us. It means, Miss Bancroft, that we have only just begun. Theodore swallowed. And what do we do now? Holmes smiled faintly. Now, my dear Watson, he murmured, we find out why the Tapestry believes I belong to them. He turned toward the exit, his coat billowing slightly as he moved. And more importantly, he glanced over his shoulder, we find out if they are right. For the first time in our long acquaintance, I saw uncertainty in Sherlock Holmes. The ledger from the archive sat between us on the table at 221B Baker Street, its aged pages holding a mystery that even he had not foreseen. His name, Sherlock Holmes, written in centuries-old ink, marked as pending. Eleanor and Theodore sat across from us, watching Holmes carefully. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the mantel clock. At last, I broke the silence. Holmes, I said carefully, you have spent your life dismissing superstition, unravelling the world's illusions. But this... I hesitated, gesturing toward the ledger. This is different, isn't it? Holmes's fingers tapped lightly against the table. His gaze was sharp, but distant, as though he were searching through 1,000 fragmented possibilities. Then he inhaled deeply. It is time, he murmured, to visit the one place we have avoided until now. I frowned. And where is that? Holmes's eyes gleamed in the firelight. The Bancroft family mausoleum. Theodore stiffened. You think the answers are in the tombs of my ancestors? Holmes stood, retrieving his coat. I think the truth has been buried for a very long time, Mr. Bancroft, and I intend to unearth it. Eleanor shivered. But what if there is something there we are not meant to find? Holmes smiled faintly. Then, Miss Bancroft, we shall find it anyway. The Bancroft mausoleum sat at the edge of the estate, a forgotten relic of stone and ivy, where generations of the family lay in eternal slumber. The iron gates creaked as we pushed them open, stepping into the cold, damp air of the crypt. The only light came from Holmes's lantern, its flickering glow illuminating the names carved into the marble tombs. Holmes moved with purpose, scanning the inscriptions. "We are looking for something out of place," he murmured. "A name that should not exist." Theodore exhaled. "My family has buried its dead here for centuries. What could possibly—" He stopped suddenly. I turned. "What is it?" Theodore's face was pale. "That name," he whispered, pointing to a weathered stone slab, half covered in moss. Holmes stepped forward, brushing away the dust. His fingers traced the engraving, his sharp gaze fixated on the words before him. And then he went completely still. I stepped closer, squinting to read the name carved into the ancient tombstone, and my breath caught. Sherlock Holmes, 1667. A suffocating silence filled the mausoleum. Eleanor whispered, That can't be." Holmes stared at the name without expression, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he crouched down, running his fingers along the base of the stone. "There is something beneath this," he murmured. With deliberate precision, he retrieved his pocketknife and pried loose a hidden compartment at the tomb's base. A small metal box fell into his hands. It was sealed with a familiar emblem, the woven knot of the Tapestry Society. Holmes exhaled slowly. "It seems I have left myself a message." Theodore's voice was hushed. "You mean someone with your name?" Holmes did not reply. Instead, he opened the box. Inside lay a single letter, preserved in wax. Holmes unfolded it, scanning the aged handwriting, and then, softly, he read aloud. "To the one who will come after me. I do not know when you will find this, but if you are reading these words, then you have already begun to see the pattern. You have already questioned why you feel as though you have walked these paths before, why you are always drawn to the threads of hidden truths, why the pattern seeks you, just as it sought me. It is not mere coincidence, nor is it fate. It is a design, one that has existed since before our names were spoken, since before the first mystery was unraveled. You are part of it now, just as I was, and just as I tried to escape it, you will try as well. But the pattern does not break. The pattern does not forget, and the pattern will find you again. Remember these words, Sherlock Holmes, for you will hear them again in time." Holmes lowered the letter, his face unreadable. Eleanor clutched my arm. "What does it mean?" Holmes's voice was very quiet. "It means, Miss Bancroft, that I am not the first Sherlock Holmes to ask these questions." His fingers tightened around the letter. "And I suspect I will not be the last." Theodore stepped back, his hands shaking. "You're telling me that you were here before?" Holmes exhaled. "Not I, Bancroft, but someone with my name, someone who knew I would come." Eleanor stared at the letter. "But how? How could they possibly—" Holmes interrupted. "Because the pattern ensures it." I felt my stomach turn. "Holmes, are you saying this society, this tapestry, has been pulling us toward them from the start?" Holmes met my gaze. "Not just from the start of this case, Watson." He held up the letter. "From the start of everything." A deep, unsettling silence followed. Then Holmes tucked the letter into his coat, straightened his collar, and turned toward the crypt's entrance. "We are not finished." Theodore inhaled sharply. "But Holmes, what do we do now?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Now, my dear Bancroft, we do what we do best." He stepped into the moonlight. "We investigate,